What if I told you that beneath the frozen ground of northern Sweden, in the shadows of the world's largest iron ore mine, lies a secret so profound that governments have spent decades ensuring you'll never believe it's real? Tonight's story isn't just fiction, it's woven from threads of actual places, real government programs, and documents that vanished from public archives. Before we descend into the darkness beneath Kiruna, I want to thank Jackman for suggesting this incredible topic, along with all of you who've been sending in these mind-bending story ideas. Keep them coming in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these late-night journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Now, dim your lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a story that will make you question what truly lies beneath our feet. Act 1. The Inheritance. The Stockholm rain hammered against the window of Lucas Eklund's cramped apartment, each droplet a tiny percussion in the symphony of another grey October morning. At 32, Lucas had already lived more lives than most embedded with peacekeepers in Kosovo, documenting refugee camps in Syria, chasing stories through the labyrinthian corridors of European bureaucracy. Now he sat at a desk cluttered with unpaid bills and half-finished articles, the glamorous life of a foreign correspondent reduced to freelance assignments about sustainable forestry and Nordic tech startups. The knock at his door came at 7:43 a.m, too early for deliveries, too late for the newspaper boy who still anachronistically served his building. Through the peephole, Lucas saw an elderly man in a wool coat, water streaming from the brim of his hat. Mr. Eklund? The voice was gravelly, tinged with the particular Swedish accent of someone who'd learned English from BBC broadcasts in the 1960s. My name is Gunnar Hedström. I was an editor at Aftonbladet until 1998. I have something that belonged to Ole K. The name stopped Lucas cold. Ole K. Ole Kinberg had been a legend in Swedish journalism circles. A man who'd spent the 1990s chasing stories about government black sites and military experiments only to disappear in 2001. Some said he'd been bought off, others that he'd been driven mad by his own theories. The official story was a hiking accident in Lapland. Body never recovered. Gunnar stood in Lucas's living room, dripping steadily onto the worn hardwood. From a leather satchel he produced a package wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax an oddly archaic touch that made Lucas's journalistic instincts twitch. Ole gave this to me 3 weeks before he disappeared, Gunnar said, his roomy eyes fixed on the package. Told me to hold it for 20 years, then find someone who wouldn't be afraid to look deeper. Your work in Kosovo, the piece about the chemical weapons that NATO denied Ole would have respected that. The package was heavier than it looked. Inside, Lucas found 3 cassette tapes, their labels faded but legible. Interview 1, January 17th, 1999. Interview 2, January 24th, 1999. And Background Must Listen First. There was also a manila folder containing photocopied documents, some in Swedish, others in English, many with sections heavily redacted. But it was the small notebook that made his hands tremble slightly page after page of coordinates, each accompanied by cryptic notes. Ventilation, shaft blocked 1994. Emergency access magnetic anomaly. Primary entrance 67.8558 degrees north, 20.2253 degrees east. That last set of coordinates, Lucas knew without checking, pointed to Kiruna, home to the world's largest underground iron ore mine, a city literally being relocated piece by piece as mining operations caused the ground to subside. Why now? Lucas asked, looking up at Gunnar. The old man was already at the door. Because they're about to tear down the old Kiruna completely. Whatever Ole found, if it's still there, it won't be for much longer. Alone again, Lucas loaded the first tape into an ancient cassette player he'd bought from a flea market years ago. The voice that emerged was calm, measured, speaking accented English, with the precision of someone who had learned it as a second language. My name is not important. What matters is what I have seen, what I know to be true despite all attempts to convince me otherwise. I worked as a contractor for the Swedish Geological Survey from 1987 to 1999. My specialty was deep earth acoustics using sound waves to map underground formations. In the winter of 1990, my team was assigned to a project near Kiruna, supposedly to assess ground stability for future mining operations. The voice paused, and Lucas could hear the distinctive sound of a cigarette being lit indoor smoking, another relic of a bygone era. What we found beneath Kiruna had nothing to do with iron ore. The chambers were already there, had been there for much longer than any human mining operation. The military knew. They'd known since at least 1969, when the first deep core samples brought up materials that couldn't be explained, alloys that shouldn't exist, organic residues that predated any known life in the region by millions of years. Lucas paused the tape, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He'd heard plenty of conspiracy theories in his career, had even chased a few. But something about the voice, the matter-of-fact delivery, devoid of the usual paranoid energy of conspiracy theorists, made him continue listening. I was part of a joint operation between the Swedish Ministry of Defence and a NATO working group called Project Deepwatch. Officially, we were mapping potential nuclear waste storage sites. Unofficially, we were documenting a vast network of chambers and tunnels that showed clear signs of artificial construction. Not human construction. The walls were smooth, melted somehow, with a glass-like finish that our engineers couldn't replicate, and the inscriptions... Another pause, longer this time. The inscriptions were in no language our linguistics experts could identify. But they were clearly a language structured, repetitive, with what appeared to be mathematical formulas integrated into the text. We took thousands of photographs. All were confiscated in 1999 when the project was suddenly terminated. The tape clicked off, leaving Lucas in silence broken only by the rain against his window. He spent the next 3 hours going through the documents. Most were mundane budget allocations, personnel transfers, equipment requisitions. But scattered throughout were anomalies that made his pulse quicken. A 1993 Swedish Defence Ministry budget that included a line item for specialised underground environment research with an allocation of 47 million krona, roughly 5 million euros in today's money. A memo from 1994 discussing unexpected biological samples from Site K7 and the need for enhanced containment protocols. A heavily redacted email chain from 1998 with visible fragments. Acoustic signature confirms. NATO liaison demands full disclosure, and most intriguingly, the Lacerta transcript must be secured. Lacerta. The word was familiar, though Lucas couldn't immediately place it. A quick internet search brought up the expected results, the genus name for various lizard species. But deeper in the search results, he found something else. References to an alleged interview with a reptilian being named Lacerta, conducted in Sweden in December 1999. Most sources treated it as obvious fiction, creative writing dressed up as truth. But the timing, the location... Lucas looked at the notebook again, at Ole's careful handwriting. Below the Kiruna coordinates was a single line. She was real. I met her. God help me, she was real. The rational part of Lucas's mind, the part trained by years of journalism, told him this was elaborate nonsense. Underground chambers could be explained by geological processes. Strange inscriptions might be pareidolia seeing patterns where none existed. The budget items could be Cold War paranoia, Sweden's attempt to keep pace with superpower military research. But old Kinberg had been neither gullible nor insane. He'd broken stories about illegal arms sales to Iraq, about corporate corruption at the highest levels of Swedish industry. If Ole had believed something was beneath Kiruna, there was at least enough there to investigate. Lucas picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he wanted. Eric Lindqvist, a cameraman who'd worked with him in Bosnia and now did freelance documentary work. Eric, it's Lucas. How do you feel about a trip to Kiruna? I've got a documentary idea about the mining industry. In October. It's already starting to freeze up there. That's the point. We want to capture the harsh conditions, the isolation. Plus, I've got a new angle, the human impact of the city relocation. Eric was silent for a moment. You're chasing something else, aren't you? Maybe. Can you be ready in 3 days? I'll bring the thermal cameras. If you're going full conspiracy theorist on me, we might as well do it properly. After ending the call, Lucas returned to the cassette player and inserted the second tape. This time the voice was different, older, more hesitant, speaking Swedish, with a distinct Sami accent. The recording quality was poorer, with wind noise in the background suggesting an outdoor interview. I was 12 when I first saw them, the voice said. This was 1971. My father was a reindeer herder, and we were following our herd near Tornatrask. There was a snowstorm coming, and we needed shelter. Father knew of some caves in the hillside, old places our people had used for generations. But that night the caves were occupied. Can you describe what you saw? Paul's voice, younger but recognisable. Lights first. Blue-white like LED, but this was long before LED. And figures tall, too thin, moving wrong. Father grabbed me and we ran. We never spoke of it, but he never took the herd that way again. Years later, when I was working at the mine, I met others who'd seen things. The company brought in special teams whenever we broke through into certain chambers. They'd seal the area, no local workers allowed. They said it was for radiation safety, but we never detected any radiation. The tape continued, but Lucas's attention was drawn to a photograph that had fallen from the folder. It showed a group of men in military uniform standing in front of what appeared to be a mine entrance. The photo was dated August 1994. One face he recognised immediately, General Karl Nordstrom, who'd later become Sweden's Chief of Defence. Another took him longer to place, but when he did, his breath caught. It was a younger version of Lars Henriksson, currently Sweden's Minister of Defence. Whatever had happened in Kiruna, it reached to the highest levels of Swedish government. Act 2. Following the coordinates. 3 days later, Lucas stood in the Kiruna airport watching his breath fog in the minus 15-degree air. October in Lapland was a liminal time too late for the midnight sun, too early for the tourist-friendly winter darkness. The town sprawled before him, a monument to human stubbornness built on ground that was literally collapsing beneath it. Eric met him at the rental car station, his van already loaded with equipment. "I did some research after your call," Eric said as they drove toward the town centre. "Kiruna's even stranger than I remembered. They're not just relocating buildings, they're moving the entire town 3 kilometres east. The official reason is ground subsidence from mining, but the pattern of collapses doesn't match normal mining degradation." "What do you mean?" "Mining subsidence is predictable, you can model it based on extraction patterns. But Kiruna has had collapses in areas that should be stable, while some heavily mined areas remain intact. It's like something else is causing selective instability." They checked into a small hotel on the outskirts of town, one of the few that would survive the relocation. The owner, a weathered woman named Astrid, eyed their equipment with suspicion. "Documentary filmmakers?" she asked in English, noting their Stockholm accents. "About the mining industry and the town relocation," Lucas confirmed. Astrid's expression softened slightly. "Good. Someone should document what we're losing. This town has secrets, you know. Stories the mining company doesn't want told." "What kind of stories?" She glanced around the empty lobby, then leaned closer. "My grandfather worked the mines in the 1940s. He used to tell us about the old tunnels, the ones that were here before LKAB started mining. The company says they're natural formations, but grandfather swore they were cut too straight, too smooth. And the sounds... Sounds? Like singing, but not human. The miners called it mountain music. Company banned anyone from talking about it in the 1960s. Said it was just acoustic effects from the mining equipment, but the old-timers knew better." That evening, Lucas and Eric visited the local library, searching through newspaper archives. The librarian, a young man named Marcus, was helpful but curious about their specific interest in 1990s military activity. "Not many people ask about that period," Marcus said, pulling out boxes of archived newspapers. "There was a media blackout on military exercises here from 1992 to 1999. National security, they said. But my uncle was a journalist for the local paper then. He always said there was more to it." The archives revealed a pattern. Throughout the 1990s there were repeated mentions of geological surveys and stability assessments, conducted by teams that included an unusual number of non-Swedish personnel. One article from 1994, buried on page 7, caught Lucas's attention. Unexplained Tremors Puzzle Scientists. The article described a series of underground vibrations detected by seismic equipment, occurring at depth far below any mining activity. A geology professor from Uppsala University was quoted saying the tremors showed characteristics inconsistent with natural tectonic activity. The professor, Lucas noted, had retired abruptly 6 months after the article was published. The next morning they drove to the coordinates from Oll's notebook. The first 3 locations were disappointment-sealed mine entrances, now behind chain-link fences marked with LKAB logos and no trespassing signs. But the 4th set of coordinates led them off the main road, down a forestry track that hadn't been maintained in years. The track ended at a concrete structure partially hidden by overgrowth. It looked like a bunker entrance from World War II, but the concrete was too new, the design too modern. A sign, faded but legible, read, "Geological Survey Station 7 authorised personnel only." Below it, almost invisible unless you knew to look, was another sign, a radiation hazard symbol accompanied by text warning of "Electromagnetic Field Hazard Pacemaker Warning." "Radiation and EM fields from a geological survey station," Eric muttered, filming the signs. "That's unusual." The entrance was sealed with a heavy steel door, but air vents on either side suggested the structure extended underground. Lucas made notes while Eric filmed, but they were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. A white SUV with government plates stopped beside their van. The woman who emerged was in her 40s, blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the kind of expensive outdoor clothing that suggested government expense accounts rather than personal purchase. "You're on restricted property," she said in accented English, clearly having noted their rental car's Stockholm plates. "We're documentary filmmakers," Lucas replied, noting that she hadn't identified herself. "Researching the history of mining in the region." "This has nothing to do with mining." She studied them with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "My name is Elle. I work for the Geological Survey. This is a decommissioned monitoring station from a 1990s research project. There's nothing here of interest to filmmakers." "Elle?" Eric asked. "Just Elle?" She smiled thinly. "In my line of work, full names are a luxury. Now, I need you to leave. This area is still contaminated from old experiments. Nothing dangerous if you leave now, but prolonged exposure wouldn't be advisable." "What kind of experiments?" Lucas pressed. "The classified kind." Her tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath it. The kind that curious journalists sometimes misinterpret, leading to embarrassment for everyone involved. "You seem intelligent, Mr. Eklund. Yes, I know who you are. Your work in Kosovo was admirable. But this isn't Kosovo. This is sovereign Swedish territory, and you're trespassing." As they prepared to leave, Elle added almost casually, "If you're truly interested in the mining industry's impact, you should interview the old-timers at the Kalixälven retirement home. They have wonderful stories about the early days of LKAB. Much more suitable for your documentary than classified government research." The drive back to Kiruna was silent until Eric finally spoke. "She knew your name." "She knew we were coming," Lucas corrected. "Someone's been watching since we arrived. Maybe since before." The retirement home suggestion was that a threat or actual advice? Only one way to find out. The Kalixälven retirement home was a modern facility on the edge of town, one of the buildings scheduled for relocation. The staff were helpful, directing them to a common room where several elderly residents gathered for afternoon coffee. Lucas had expected to work slowly up to his real questions, but an elderly man named Niels Persson cut straight through his cover story. "You're not here about regular mining," Niels said, his voice still strong despite his 91 years. "You're here about the deep work, the tunnels that weren't supposed to exist." The room fell silent. Other residents shifted uncomfortably, but Niels continued. "I was a shaft engineer from 1952 to 1987. We broke through into the first anomalous chamber in 1969, 1,200 metres down, far below any natural cave formation should exist at that latitude. The walls were smooth as glass, curved in ways that hurt your eyes to follow. Management immediately classified it, brought in government types. But I saw the photographs before they were confiscated. Photographs of what? Lucas asked. Machines. Or what looked like machines. Crystalline structures that couldn't be natural but predated any human presence by millennia. And bones not human, but not any animal we recognised either. Long, with the wrong number of joints. An elderly woman, Ingrid, spoke up. My husband worked security for the Special Projects Division in the 1990s. He never talked about it, but he had nightmares. Kept saying they're still down there in his sleep. When he retired, they made him sign papers, threatened our pensions if he ever spoke about what he'd seen. Did anyone ever try to go public? Eric asked, camera rolling. Old Kinberg did, Niels replied, and Lucas's pulse quickened. Came here in 1999, asking the same questions you are. We told him what we knew, gave him names, dates. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Hiking accident, they said. But Ol was no hiker. He was murdered for getting too close to the truth. What truth? Lucas pressed. Niels looked around the room, then back at Lucas. That we're not alone on this planet. That we never have been. And that our government has been hiding evidence of a parallel civilization that exists beneath our feet. The Kiruna mine didn't discover them, it disturbed them. And now, with the deep drilling, with the town relocation, they're trying to seal it all away before anyone realises what's really down there. That night, Lucas listened to the third tape from Ole's collection. This one was different, Ole himself speaking, apparently recording notes for a story he never got to write. The Lacerta interview changes everything. If it's real, and my source insists it is, then the chambers beneath Kiruna aren't archaeological sites. They're active habitations. The being calling itself Lacerta claimed to be part of a species that evolved on Earth millions of years before humans, driven underground by a catastrophe they won't specify. She said there are 7 major colonies worldwide, with the Nordic colony being one of the oldest. Ole's voice grew more agitated as the recording continued. The government knows. NATO knows. They've been monitoring the situation since at least 1969, possibly earlier. The electromagnetic anomalies aren't from the mythical beings themselves, but from their technology, some kind of field generation that interferes with human electronics. That's why so many military projects in the area have been classified. They're not studying them, they're negotiating with them. The tape ended with Ole's final words. I'm going back to Kiruna tomorrow. My contact says they've agreed to let me document one of the chambers. If something happens to me, these tapes are my insurance. The world needs to know. Act 3. The Leak. Lucas stared at his laptop screen, the cursor blinking in the empty text field of a secure messaging app. For 3 days he'd debated what to do with the information he'd gathered. The journalist in him wanted to publish everything immediately, but the skeptic demanded more proof. The photographs from the retirement home interviews, the government surveillance, L's thinly veiled warnings, it all suggested something significant, but none of it proved the existence of an underground civilization. He decided to test the waters. Using a pseudonymous account, he posted a carefully edited portion of his findings to an obscure forum dedicated to European military history. He included the budget documents showing the 47 million krona allocation, the memo about unexpected biological samples, and a brief description of the sealed facilities around Kiruna. He made no mention of reptilian beings or ancient civilizations, framing it instead as potential evidence of illegal biological weapons research. The response was immediate and alarming. Within 30 minutes his post was deleted. Within an hour his laptop screen flickered and went black. When it restarted, his hard drive had been wiped clean, not just formatted, but overwritten with random data in a way that made recovery impossible. Only his external backup drive, disconnected and hidden in his hotel room safe, remained intact. Eric found him staring at the blank screen. What happened? Someone just demonstrated their reach, Lucas replied. Professional data destruction executed remotely. This isn't some local cover-up. This is intelligence service level capability. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Swedish country code. Mr. Eklund, the voice was male, cultured, speaking Swedish with a slight Stockholm accent. Your recent online activities have attracted attention. I represent certain interests that would prefer to handle this matter quietly. Who is this? Someone offering you an opportunity. There's a restaurant called Arktiska. Be there in 1 hour, come alone, bring your backup drive. The line went dead. Arktiska was nearly empty when Lucas arrived. A man in his 50s sat in a corner booth, expensive suit incongruous in the casual restaurant. He gestured for Lucas to sit. "My name is irrelevant," the man began, "but my authority is not. I represent a working group that coordinates between Swedish intelligence, the military, and certain international partners. Your investigation has touched upon matters of national security. Biological weapons research is illegal under international law," Lucas countered. The man smiled. "Is that what you think this is about? Mr. Eklund, what would you say if I told you that everything in those documents you found is true, but your interpretation is completely wrong?" He produced a tablet, swiping through images that made Lucas's breath catch. Underground chambers with impossibly smooth walls, crystalline structures that looked both organic and mechanical, and clearest of all, a wall covered in symbols that definitely represented some form of writing. "These are from the 1994 expedition," the man explained. "What we found predates human civilization by at least 65 million years. Not weapons research, Mr. Eklund. Archaeology. Xenoarchaeology, to be precise." "You're saying—" "I'm saying that in 1969, the Kiruna mine broke through into a network of artificial chambers that shouldn't exist. Since then, we've been trying to understand what we found. The biological samples weren't weapons, they were remains. Preserved tissue from beings that weren't human, but were undeniably intelligent." The man leaned forward. "Your old Kinberg got closer to the truth than anyone outside the program. His Lacerta interview, we know he met someone or something. We've been trying to find his contact ever since. That's why we've allowed you to continue your investigation. We hoped you might lead us to answers. If this is all legitimate archaeology, why the secrecy? Why the surveillance?" "Because humanity isn't ready. Can you imagine the panic if people learned they weren't Earth's first intelligent species? The religious implications alone would destabilize entire nations. We're not hiding the truth forever, just until we understand it better. And if I refuse to stop my investigation—" The man's expression hardened. "Then you'll find your life becoming very difficult. Not threats, Mr. Eklund, just reality. Your freelance contracts will dry up. Your visa applications for international work will be denied. You'll become, quite simply, unemployable in journalism." He stood, leaving a flash drive on the table. "This contains enough classified material to satisfy your curiosity without endangering national security. Take it, study it, then decide whether the story you want to tell is worth the price you'll pay for telling it." Back in his hotel room, Lucas examined the flash drive's contents with Eric. It contained hundreds of documents, photographs, and video files. Most were technical geological surveys, chemical analyses of unknown alloys, linguistic studies of the inscriptions. But buried in the files was something extraordinary. Thermal imaging from 2011 showing vast chambers beneath Kiruna, some large enough to hold entire buildings, all connected by a network of tunnels that extended for kilometers. "This is incredible," Eric breathed. "If this is real—" "It's real," Lucas said. "The question is whether it's complete. They're showing us what they want us to see, not necessarily everything." His phone buzzed. Another unknown number, but this time the message was in English. "They're lying. The chambers aren't abandoned. Check the thermal imaging for heat signatures they missed. 67.8691 degrees north, 20.2156 degrees east. Midnight. Come alone." Lucas showed Eric the message. It could be a trap, or it could be Ole's source, the one he called Lacerta. They spent the rest of the day analysing the thermal imaging. Eric had experience with photographic analysis from his documentary work, and he found what the anonymous sender had suggested: subtle heat signatures in some of the chambers, patterns that suggested active thermal management rather than natural geothermal activity. "Someone's editing these images," Eric concluded. "Not crudely, this is professional work, but there are artifacts from the manipulation. Original heat sources have been masked." As midnight approached, Lucas prepared to meet his mysterious contact. The coordinates led to an abandoned mining equipment warehouse on the outskirts of town. Eric wanted to accompany him, but Lucas insisted on following the instructions. The warehouse was dark, lit only by moonlight streaming through broken windows. Lucas waited, every sound making him tense. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Elle, the government geologist. But something about her was different, her movements too fluid, her eyes reflecting light in a way human eyes shouldn't. "You're very persistent, Mr. Eklund," she said, but her voice had changed, taking on harmonics that made his skin crawl. Ol was the same way. It killed him, you know. Not literally, we don't harm humans unless absolutely necessary, but the knowledge broke something in him. You're not human." She smiled, and for a moment her features seemed to shift, becoming something else before snapping back to human appearance. "I'm as human as I choose to appear. We've been practicing for millennia. Some of us can pass perfectly, others less so." The Lacerta interview, it was real. Real is a complicated concept. The being Ole interviewed was real, yes, but much of what she told him was simplified, sanitized for human consumption. We're not reptilian in the way you understand, that's just how your pattern recognition interprets us. We're something older, something that doesn't fit your taxonomies. Why reveal yourself to me? Because the government's plan is failing. The deep drilling, the town relocation, they think they can seal us away, pretend we don't exist. But we've been here longer than your species has existed. We'll be here long after you're gone. The question is whether we coexist peacefully, or whether fear and ignorance lead to tragedy. She handed him a metal cylinder, about the size of a flashlight but covered in the same symbols from the underground chambers. "This contains our real history. Not the fiction we fed Olor, but the truth about what we are, where we came from, and why we stayed hidden. Your technology can't read it yet, but in time, when you're ready, it will reveal itself. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. But consider this: if we wanted to harm humanity, we've had 65 million years to do it. We've watched you evolve, watched you spread across the planet, watched you dig deeper and deeper into our domain. We've never interfered. We just want to be left alone. The government thinks the chambers are abandoned." Elle laughed, a sound that wasn't quite human. "They see what we allow them to see. The chambers they found are the ones we abandoned centuries ago. Our real cities are deeper, shielded in ways your technology can't penetrate. But the mining is getting closer, and we're running out of places to retreat. So what do you want from me? Tell the truth, but tell it carefully. If you frame this as alien invasion or conspiracy theory, no one will believe you, and you'll be dismissed as another crackpot. But if you focus on the verifiable facts, the government cover-up, the military involvement, the suppression of archaeological discoveries, you might just open enough minds to prevent a catastrophe." She turned to leave, then paused. "Ole asked me once what we feared most about discovery. I told him it wasn't human violence we've survived worse. It's human curiosity. Once you know we exist, you'll never stop trying to find us, study us, understand us. And in doing so, you might destroy both our civilizations." Act 4. The Dissent. The meeting with Elle, or whatever she truly was, left. Lucas shaken but determined. He had 3 pieces of evidence now: the government documents, the thermal imaging showing active heat signatures, and the mysterious cylinder. The first 2 could be verified and potentially published. The third remained an enigma, its surface symbols seeming to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Eric had spent the night analysing the thermal imaging data while Lucas was at the warehouse. His findings were disturbing. "Look at this," Eric said, pointing to his laptop screen. "The heat signatures follow a pattern, regular intervals, consistent temperatures. This isn't random geothermal activity, it's climate control. Someone or something is maintaining specific temperatures in those chambers. The government has to know," Lucas mused. "The data came from their servers. Unless they're not looking for it. If you expect empty archaeological sites, you might explain away heat signatures as equipment malfunction or natural phenomena. But if you know something's living down there..." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Lucas checked the peephole to find Marcus, the librarian. looking nervous and carrying a cardboard box. "I'm sorry to bother you," Marcus said when Lucas let him in, "but my uncle, the journalist I mentioned, he died last week. Heart attack, they said, but he was healthy as a horse. Before he died, he told me if anyone came asking about the 1990s military activity, I should give them this." The box contained notebooks, photographs, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. Marcus's uncle had been documenting unusual activities around Kiruna for decades, creating a parallel history to the official narrative. One map in particular caught Lucas's attention. It showed the mine's official layout overlaid with additional passages marked in red ink. A note in the margin read, "Ventilation tunnels sealed 1994-1997. Still accessible through maintenance shaft 7. Guards posted until 2001, then abandoned." "Your uncle explored these tunnels?" Lucas asked. "He tried to, several times. Got caught twice, warned off by military police. But he said there was one route they missed, an old ventilation shaft from the 1950s that connected to the newer system. It's how the workers used to sneak out for unauthorized breaks." Marcus pulled out a photograph, grainy but clear enough. It showed a massive underground space, lit by what appeared to be industrial lighting. But the walls weren't rough rock, they were smooth, almost organic looking, with the same glassy finish described by the witnesses at the retirement home. When was this taken? 2003. My uncle managed to get about 200 metres into the restricted area before he heard something that scared him off. He never went back, but he said what he saw changed his entire worldview. That evening, Lucas and Eric made a decision that would either vindicate their investigation or end very badly. Using Marcus's uncle's maps and the coordinates from Old's notebook, they planned an unauthorized exploration of the sealed tunnels. They prepared carefully. Eric had thermal cameras, air quality monitors, and enough battery power for 8 hours of recording. Lucas carried copies of all their evidence, ready to upload to multiple cloud servers if they found anything significant. They also left detailed notes with Marcus, instructions to release everything to international media if they didn't return within 12 hours. Maintenance shaft 7 was exactly where the map indicated, hidden behind a derelict equipment shed 3 kilometres from the main mining complex. The lock had been cut years ago and never replaced, suggesting they weren't the first unauthorised visitors. The descent was easier than expected. The shaft had a ladder, rusty but solid, and the air, while stale, was breathable. 50 metres down they reached a horizontal tunnel, clearly part of the original mine ventilation system. But after another 100 metres, everything changed. The rough mining tunnel gave way to something else entirely. The walls became smooth, curved in impossible ways that seemed to defy three-dimensional geometry. The temperature rose noticeably, and their equipment began registering electromagnetic anomalies. "Are you getting this?" Lucas whispered, though the tunnel seemed to swallow sound. Eric nodded, panning his camera across surfaces that appeared to shimmer with an inner light. "The thermal readings are off the charts. Something's generating massive amounts of heat below us." They continued deeper, following the main passage as it spiraled downward. After what felt like hours, but was only 30 minutes according to their watches, they emerged into a vast chamber that took their breath away. The space was enormous, larger than any cathedral, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. But it wasn't the size that stunned them, it was the structures. Crystalline formations that were clearly artificial rose from the floor like frozen waterfalls, pulsing with soft blue-white light. Along the walls, those same indecipherable symbols they'd seen in photographs were carved deep into the rock, some glowing faintly. "This is it," Eric breathed, filming everything. "This is what they've been hiding." They explored the chamber methodically, documenting everything. In one corner they found equipment abandoned by previous expeditions. Swedish military crates dated 1994, a NATO surveillance station that looked like it had been hastily evacuated, and most remarkably a modern computer terminal that was still functioning, powered by cables that disappeared into the wall. Lucas activated the terminal. It required no password, displaying files in Swedish and English. Most were sensor readings, temperature, radiation levels, seismic activity. But one folder, labelled Contact Protocols, contained something extraordinary. Video files, dozens of them, dated between 1994 and 2011. Lucas opened the most recent. The screen showed this very chamber, but occupied. Military personnel in hazmat suits were setting up equipment, while a figure stood in the centre, tall, too thin, with movements that weren't quite human. The figure wore a hooded robe that obscured its features, but when it turned toward the camera, its eyes reflected light like a cat's. A Swedish officer approached the figure, speaking English. "We need more time. The mining company is pushing to expand operations." The figure's response was in accented English, but with those strange harmonics L had demonstrated. "Time is what we've given you for 50 years. We cannot retreat further. The deep chambers are our last refuge. If the public learns, then perhaps it's time they did. Secrecy has served neither of our species well." The video cut off abruptly. Lucas quickly copied everything onto multiple drives, his hands shaking with the magnitude of what they'd found. A sound echoed through the chamber footsteps, many of them approaching from the tunnel they'd entered through. Eric grabbed his equipment. "We need to go. Now." But as they turned to leave, they found their exit blocked. A squad of Swedish military personnel emerged from the tunnel, weapons drawn but not quite aimed at them. Behind the soldiers walked a familiar figure, the man from the restaurant, still in his expensive suit despite the underground environment. "Mr. Eklund, Mr. Lindqvist," he said calmly, "you've been remarkably resourceful. Unfortunately, you've also committed several crimes, including trespassing on classified military property and theft of state secrets." "This needs to be public," Lucas argued. "People have a right to know." "Do they? Do people have a right to information that could cause mass panic, economic collapse and potentially interspecies conflict?" Before anyone could respond, the temperature in the chamber suddenly spiked. The crystalline structures began pulsing more rapidly, and a low harmonic tone filled the air, felt as much as heard. The soldiers looked nervous, some backing toward the tunnel. From the far side of the chamber, where deep shadows had hidden additional passages, figures emerged. 3 of them, tall and thin like the one in the video, wearing similar robes. But as they approached, they lowered their hoods. Lucas heard Eric's camera hit the ground. They weren't reptilian, exactly, but they weren't human either. Their features were elongated, their skin with a subtle, scaled texture that seemed to shift between colours. Their eyes were large, multifaceted, like an insect's, but with an unmistakably intelligent gaze. The lead being spoke, its voice filling the chamber without seeming to come from its mouth. "Enough!" Everyone froze. Even the suited man seemed taken aback. 50 years of negotiations, 50 years of delays, and still you point weapons in our sacred spaces. The being turned to Lucas and Eric. "And you, driven by curiosity, stumble into matters beyond your comprehension." "We just want the truth," Lucas managed. "The truth?" The being made a sound that might have been laughter. "The truth is that we've shared this planet since before your ancestors learned to walk upright. We survived the extinction that killed the dinosaurs by retreating underground. We've watched your species evolve, watched you conquer the surface world. We've hidden not from fear, but from wisdom. Your species has never reacted well to difference." The suited man stepped forward. "The protocols." "Your protocols have failed," the being interrupted. "The mining grows deeper, your weapons more destructive. We can no longer retreat, so we offer a new arrangement." The being gestured, and images appeared in the air, holographic projections showing underground cities of impossible beauty, technologies that defied current human understanding, and populations of beings living in sophisticated societies. "We will reveal ourselves gradually. Selected scientists, leaders, thinkers will learn of us first. Over a generation, maybe 2, humanity will come to accept that you're not alone. In exchange, certain areas will be protected from mining, from development. Our cities will remain ours." "And if humanity refuses?" the suited man asked. "Then we reveal ourselves anyway, but without preparation, without context. Imagine the chaos when mining operations worldwide begin breaking through into our territories. Better to control the revelation than let it explode randomly." The being turned back to Lucas. Your role in this is crucial. You will tell a story, not the whole truth, but enough. You'll speak of government cover-ups, of archaeological discoveries suggesting ancient civilizations. You'll prepare minds without shocking them. In essence, you'll make us mythology before we become reality. And if I refuse, then someone else will be chosen. But you've proven yourself capable, curious but not reckless, sceptical but not closed-minded. Old Kinberg chose well when he left you his research. You knew Ole? We knew of him. He was too early, too direct. The world wasn't ready. But now, with your technology advancing, your society's more connected. Perhaps the time has come. The suited man looked defeated. This isn't my decision to make. I'll need to contact my superiors. You have 1 year, Being said. After that, we begin revealing ourselves with or without your cooperation. Act 5. The Silencing. The journey back to the surface felt surreal. The soldiers escorted them in silence, the suited man speaking rapidly into a satellite phone in Swedish, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. At the tunnel entrance, their equipment was confiscated, though Lucas had expected this and had already uploaded the crucial files to his cloud servers during their exploration. You understand, the suited man said as they stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the shaft, that everything you've witnessed is classified, beyond any level you've previously encountered. The agreements you're about to sign aren't just about national security, they're about species security. Over the next 3 days, Lucas and Eric were debriefed by teams of officials from agencies they hadn't known existed. They signed documents in Swedish, English, and surprisingly, Russian and Mandarin. The implications were clear this wasn't just Sweden's secret. But on the third night, a different visitor came to Lucas's hotel room. Elle entered without knocking, once again moving with that too fluid grace that betrayed her nature. They're going to bury this, she said simply. The governments will debate, form committees, study the implications. Meanwhile, the mining continues, the encounters increase, and fear builds on both sides. The being in the chamber said I had a role to play. That being was an optimist. I'm a realist. Your governments will never voluntarily reveal our existence, so we need another approach. She handed him a flash drive. Everything's here. Video from encounters dating back to 1947, government documents from 12 nations, and most importantly, communication recordings between our representatives and your leaders. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to make people question. Why not release it all? Because chaos serves no one. We need gradual acclimation, not shock. Publish what you can verify independently. Frame it as you suggested: government conspiracy, hidden archaeology. Let people draw their own conclusions. And you? What's your real role in this? Elle smiled, her features momentarily shifting to something not quite human before snapping back. I'm what you might call a cultural ambassador. I've lived among humans for 40 years, learning your ways, your fears, your potential. There are dozens like me, integrated into your societies, waiting for the day we can drop our disguises. She moved to the window, looking out at the lights of Kiruna. Your species stands at a crossroads. In the next decade, you'll either accept that you share this planet, or you'll force a confrontation that nobody wins. The choice is yours. After she left, Lucas made his decision. He returned to Stockholm with a story, but not the one anyone expected. His article, published simultaneously in 3 international outlets, focused on verifiable facts. The massive budget allocations for geological research, the sealed tunnels and military presence around Kiruna, the testimonies of witnesses who'd seen unexplained chambers and artifacts. He included the thermal imaging showing active heat management in supposedly empty caverns. He made no claims about reptilian beings or underground civilizations. Instead, he posed questions. What required such extreme secrecy? Why were archaeological discoveries being classified at the highest levels? What were governments afraid citizens might learn? The response was immediate and predictable. Swedish authorities dismissed the article as conspiracy theory, though they notably didn't deny the specific budget items or military operations he documented. His press credentials were revoked, his freelance contracts cancelled. But online, the story took on a life of its own. Other journalists began investigating similar sites in their own countries. Former military personnel came forward with corroborating stories. Scientists pointed out geological anomalies that couldn't be easily explained. Within 6 months, the pressure for disclosure was building. Parliamentary inquiries were launched. Freedom of information requests flooded government agencies, and in the background, more accidents occurred, mining operations breaking through into chambers that shouldn't exist, military teams photographed at sites they claimed weren't restricted. 1 year after his encounter in the chamber, Lucas received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a clear, undeniable image of one of the beings, standing in what was obviously a modern government facility, shaking hands with someone whose face was obscured but whose uniform was clearly military. Attached was a note in elegant handwriting: Phase 1 complete. Prepare for Phase 2. Lucas sat in his new apartment he'd been forced to move after too many random break-ins at his old place, staring at the cylindrical artifact Elle had given him. It had begun to change recently, the symbols glowing faintly at night, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense. Eric visited regularly, both of them changed by what they'd witnessed. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Eric asked one evening. "Keeping the full truth hidden?" Lucas turned the cylinder in his hands, watching the symbols shift. Sometimes the greatest truths need to be approached sideways. If we'd published everything the videos, the direct contact we'd have been dismissed as lunatics. But by focusing on what could be verified, we've planted seeds of doubt. People are beginning to ask the right questions. And when they're ready for answers... Lucas gestured to his laptop where encrypted files waited the full videos from the chamber, the complete transcripts of interspecies negotiations, clear photographs of the beings themselves. Then we moved to Phase 2, but not yet. Humanity needs time to adjust to the idea that we're not alone before we confront the reality of who we're sharing the planet with. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number, but the message was in that strange harmonic text he'd learned to recognise as non-human communication, translated through digital systems. "The Deep Council has voted. Gradual revelation approved. Your species has 5 years to prepare. Use them wisely." Lucas looked out his window at Stockholm's skyline, imagining the vast chambers and ancient cities that lay beneath. Somewhere down there, another civilization waited, watched, and hoped that humanity would prove worthy of the truth. The story old Kinberg had died trying to tell would finally be told not as a shocking revelation, but as a gradual awakening. The world would learn that myths sometimes have foundations in reality, that governments sometimes hide truths too large for immediate comprehension, and that humanity's position as Earth's sole intelligent species was nothing more than a comfortable illusion. In his desk drawer beside the cylinder lay one last piece of evidence, a photograph Lucas had taken in the chamber, but never shared. It showed a section of wall covered in symbols, but among them was something remarkable. Cave paintings, clearly prehistoric, showing human figures standing beside tall, thin beings with large eyes. Even tens of thousands of years ago, someone had tried to record the truth of humanity's neighbours. Perhaps this time, Lucas thought, the world would be ready to listen. Epilogue. 5 years later, the headlines were subtle but significant. Major archaeological discovery suggests pre-human intelligence. The article, carefully crafted by a consortium of scientists and journalists, described the recent discovery of artificial chambers beneath northern Europe, their builders unknown but clearly intelligent. Lucas, now writing under a pseudonym, contributed to the coverage. He noticed how carefully the narrative was being managed, each revelation slightly more extraordinary than the last, but never so shocking as to cause panic. The beings were keeping their promise, revealing themselves gradually, letting humanity adjust to each new impossibility before introducing the next. In Kiruna, the mine had ceased operations in certain sectors, officially due to geological instability. Unofficially, new treaties had been signed, borders established between the world above and the world below. And late at night, when Stockholm slept, Lucas would sometimes see them figures too tall, moving too fluidly, visible only to those who knew what to look for. They walked among humans more openly now, though still disguised. preparing for the day when they wouldn't need to hide. The cylinder L had given him now displayed readable text, a history of Earth that predated humanity by eons, a story of survival and adaptation, of civilizations rising and falling long before the first human drew breath. One passage haunted him. "We do not fear your weapons or your anger. We fear your inability to accept that you are not special, not chosen, not alone. We fear that in learning of us you will lose yourselves." But as Lucas watched humanity slowly, cautiously, begin to accept the impossible, he felt hope. Perhaps his species was more adaptable than the beings below believed. Perhaps this revelation wouldn't break humanity but transform it. The truth was emerging from the depths of Kiruna, not as an eruption, but as a slow dawn. And humanity, step by careful step, was learning to see by its light. In the end, old Kinberg had been both right and wrong. The truth did need to be told, but it needed to be told carefully, patiently, with respect for both the tellers and the listeners. As Lucas closed his laptop and prepared for bed, his phone displayed one final message. "Thank you for teaching us that truth, like evolution, happens gradually." Outside, Stockholm slumbered on, unaware that beneath its streets another city stirred. The two worlds, separate for so long, were slowly, inevitably converging. The age of hiding was ending. The age of coexistence was about to begin. Imagine discovering that your government has been lying to you about the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. Imagine learning that while officials tell you everything is normal, they've been secretly building underground cities for themselves and their families. Imagine realizing that 300 million Americans have been marked as acceptable losses in a disaster that's not a matter of if, but when. This is a story based on real geological science, actual government protocols, and the terrifying possibility that the truth about Yellowstone is being hidden from you right now. What happens when the greatest natural disaster in human history has been predicted, planned for, and hidden from the public? When a junior geologist stumbles upon evidence that the Yellowstone supervolcano isn't dormant, it's being managed, he discovers that some truths are worth killing for. Special thanks to Nicola for this incredible story concept and detailed research that made this narrative possible. Yellowstone National Park Monitoring Station, October the 15th, 2014. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Eli Grant barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the seismic readout scrolling across his monitor, watching patterns that shouldn't exist dance across the screen like digital ghosts. At 24, fresh out of graduate school with a geology degree from Colorado State, Eli had spent the last 3 months as a USGS intern learning that monitoring America's most dangerous supervolcano was mostly routine data collection, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. This was one of those moments. The microquakes were coming from depths that made his stomach turn. 15 miles down, deeper than any recorded activity in Yellowstone's 30-year digital monitoring history. The frequency was wrong too, clustered in tight bursts rather than the random scatter typical of normal geothermal activity. Each tremor registered between 1.2 and 1.8 on the Richter scale, small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they painted a picture that made Eli's hand shake as he reached for his phone. Before he could dial his supervisor, the screen flickered. The anomalous readings vanished, replaced by a steady green line indicating normal background activity. A automated message popped up. Calibration complete. Data archived. Eli stared at the empty screen. 15 minutes of unprecedented deep seismic activity had just been erased as if it never existed. He quickly navigated to the backup servers, his fingers flying across the keyboard with increasing desperation. The raw data files were gone. The automated alerts had been cleared. Even the emergency notification logs showed nothing but routine system maintenance. "Working late again, kid?" Eli spun around to find Karen Holt standing in the doorway, her park ranger uniform still crisp despite the late hour. At 52, Karen had been patrolling Yellowstone's backcountry for over 2 decades, and her weathered face carried the kind of knowledge that came from watching the park's moods change with the seasons. "Karen, did you feel anything about an hour ago? Any tremors?" She studied his face carefully before stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "You saw something on the monitors?" "Deep quakes, deeper than anything in the database, but they're gone now, scrubbed clean like they never happened." Karen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the sanitized readouts. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Eli had never heard before. "How long have you been working here, Eli?" 3 months. "Long enough to know what you're looking at, not long enough to know what you're not supposed to see." She pulled up a chair beside him. "Let me ask you something. You know why they put the monitoring station here instead of closer to the caldera?" Eli shrugged. "Better communication links, I assumed. Easier access for maintenance." "That's what they tell the interns." Karen's fingers drummed against the desk. "The real reason is that certain types of data collection work better from a distance. Gives you time to curate what goes into the public record." The implication hit Eli like a physical blow. "Are you saying they're hiding seismic data?" "I'm saying that 23 years of watching this place has taught me that Yellowstone keeps secrets, and some people are very invested in keeping those secrets buried." She stood up, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Don't start asking questions you're not ready to answer, Eli. This park isn't just about geysers." After she left, Eli sat alone in the monitoring station, staring at the clean, normal readouts. But Karen's warning had sparked something dangerous. Curiosity. He pulled up the archived database and began searching for gaps, periods where data might have been scrubbed before. What he found made his pulse quicken. Small deletions in 2009, 2004, and 1997. Always deep seismic activity. Always erased within hours of being recorded. Always during periods when public attention was focused elsewhere. Economic crashes, natural disasters, political scandals. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Eli spent the rest of the night copying every piece of raw data he could access onto external drives, working with the methodical precision of someone who understood that some opportunities only came once. By dawn, he had assembled a fragmentary picture of Yellowstone's hidden activity dating back 15 years. The supervolcano wasn't dormant. It was being watched, monitored, and most importantly hidden from public view. As the sun rose over the Yellowstone River, Eli Grant became the first person outside the conspiracy to see the full scope of what was coming. What he didn't know was that his discovery had already been noted by systems designed to catch exactly this kind of unauthorized access. In a secure facility 300 miles away, automated alerts were already being generated, and decisions were being made about what to do with a curious young geologist who had seen too much. Chapter 1. The Official Story. Yellowstone National Park Headquarters, March 22nd, 2015. The press briefing room was packed with reporters from every major network, their cameras trained on the panel of scientists seated behind a table adorned with official USGS and National Park Service seals. Outside, early spring snow dusted the peaks surrounding Mammoth Hot Springs, but inside the room, the atmosphere was warm with the heat of television lights and simmering questions about Yellowstone's recent activity. Eli stood at the back of the room, his USGS badge giving him access to the media event despite his junior status. In the 5 months since he'd first witnessed the data scrubbing, he'd kept his head down and his mouth shut, but he'd also kept watching. The patterns were becoming clearer and more disturbing with each passing week. Chief Park Scientist Janet Morrison stepped up to the microphone, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. "Good morning. I want to address the speculation that's been circulating online regarding recent seismic activity in Yellowstone National Park." Eli noticed how she avoided mentioning the source of that speculation, a viral video showing hundreds of elk and bison streaming out of the Lamar Valley in what appeared to be a coordinated exodus. The footage had been taken by a tourist 3 weeks earlier and had garnered over 2 million views before park officials managed to provide alternative explanations. Based on our continuous monitoring of the Yellowstone volcanic system, Morrison continued, I can state categorically that no eruption is imminent. The seismic activity recorded over the past month falls well within normal parameters for this geologically active region. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. But what about the animal migrations? Local ranchers are reporting unusual behaviour in wildlife populations. Seasonal migration patterns can vary significantly based on weather conditions, food availability, and natural population cycles, Morrison replied smoothly. What some observers have interpreted as unusual behaviour is actually quite normal for this time of year. Eli bit back the urge to laugh. He'd seen the internal memos describing the animal movements as unprecedented and potentially indicative of subsurface environmental changes. The scientists on this panel knew exactly what was causing the animals to flee, but they were standing in front of cameras and lying about it with practiced ease. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, each one deflected with rehearsed responses that provided just enough technical detail to sound authoritative while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. As the briefing ended and reporters filed out, Eli lingered near the back of the room, watching the scientists pack up their materials. Impressive performance. Eli turned to find a man in his 40s wearing a FEMA windbreaker, his identification badge hanging from a lanyard around his neck. Deputy Director Marcus Webb, according to the credential. I'm sorry? The briefing. Very professional. Of course, the real challenge isn't managing the press, it's managing the logistics. Webb's smile was friendly, but his eyes remained cold. You're Eli Grant, aren't you? The intern who's been asking interesting questions. Eli's mouth went dry. I don't know what you mean. Database queries at odd hours, unusual download activity, IT security flags that kind of behaviour automatically. Webb stepped closer, lowering his voice. Don't worry. Curiosity is natural in your line of work, but there are some areas where curiosity can become problematic. Are you threatening me? I'm offering advice. FEMA has been conducting training exercises in this region for several months now. Interagency coordination, emergency response protocols, that sort of thing. You might have noticed our vehicles around the park. Eli had noticed. Black SUVs and unmarked trucks had been appearing at various locations throughout Yellowstone, always accompanied by personnel who claimed to be conducting routine training exercises. The timing seemed suspicious. Why increase emergency preparedness training just as seismic activity was being actively suppressed from public records? What kind of training? Webb's smile widened. Zone 5 evacuation protocols. Very comprehensive, very necessary. He handed Eli a business card. If you ever want to know more about emergency preparedness, give me a call. But remember, some knowledge comes with responsibilities. After Webb walked away, Eli stood alone in the empty briefing room, turning the card over in his hands. Zone 5 evacuation protocols. He'd never heard the term before, despite his security clearance and access to most FEMA documentation. That night, he spent hours searching through official databases, finding references to Zones 1 through 4, but nothing about Zone 5. Whatever Webb was talking about, it existed outside the normal chain of command and public accountability. The realization sent a chill down Eli's spine that had nothing to do with the late spring snow falling outside his apartment window. 3 days later, Karen Holt found him in the monitoring station, hunched over his computer with the intensity of someone racing against time. You're digging deeper, she observed, and not bothering to make it a question. Someone has to. They're lying to everyone, Karen. The seismic data, the animal behaviour, the FEMA exercises, none of it adds up to the story they're telling the public. Karen closed the door and activated the white noise generator that was supposedly used to prevent electronic eavesdropping during sensitive conferences. What do you know about the Deep Bore project? Never heard of it. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was a joint USGS military operation that ran from 2008 to 2012. The cover story was installation of advanced seismic monitoring equipment in previously inaccessible areas of the park. And the real story, Pressure venting? They were drilling down to the magma chamber and installing systems designed to release pressure in controlled amounts, potentially delaying or preventing a catastrophic eruption. Eli stared at her. That's actually brilliant. Why would they hide something like that? Because it didn't work. The magma chamber is too large, too unstable. The venting systems were supposed to buy us decades. Instead, they may have accelerated the timeline. Karen's face was grim. One of the contractors died during the installation phase. Officially, it was an industrial accident. Unofficially, he was murdered to prevent him from talking about what he discovered down there. What did he discover? That the eruption isn't a matter of if, Eli. It's a matter of when. And when is a lot sooner than anyone is willing to admit publicly. As Karen left him alone with this revelation, Eli found himself staring at the sanitized seismic readouts with new understanding. The data scrubbing wasn't just about hiding Yellowstone's activity from the public. It was about hiding the failure of a desperate attempt to prevent the greatest natural disaster in human history. And somewhere, people with access to the real data were making plans that didn't include the 300 million Americans living in the path of destruction. Chapter 2. The Elite Plan. USGS Regional Office, Denver, September 14th, 2016. The security badge scanner beeped as Eli swiped his credential, granting him access to the restricted archives beneath the Denver Federal Building. 18 months had passed since his first glimpse of the conspiracy, and his official duties had gradually shifted from basic monitoring to special projects, a euphemism for working on data sets that required higher security clearances and absolute discretion. What his supervisors didn't know was that Eli had been using his expanded access to piece together a puzzle that grew more terrifying with each new fragment of information he uncovered. The file he'd been looking for was buried in a section marked HLT 2030, nestled between routine geological surveys and budget projections for monitoring equipment. Hazard level threshold 2030. The designation meant nothing to most people, but Eli had learned to recognize the bureaucratic camouflage used to hide the most sensitive documents. He opened the file with trembling fingers. The first page was a summary that made his vision blur. Probabilistic eruption window, 2028 to 2032. Confidence interval, 94.7%. Recommended public disclosure timeline, none. Eli had to read the last line 3 times before its meaning sank in. They had narrowed down the eruption timeline to a 4-year window with near certainty, and the official recommendation was to tell the public nothing. The next section detailed evacuation protocols that divided the American population into 2 distinct categories. Tier 1 included federal government personnel, military leadership, critical infrastructure managers, and selected scientific and medical professionals, approximately 2.3 million people, who would receive advance warning and priority evacuation to designated safe zones. Tier 2 encompassed everyone else, 327 million Americans whose evacuation status was listed with brutal honesty as no viable plan. Eli scrolled through page after page of logistical nightmares and resource calculations. The ash fallout zone would render most of the continental United States uninhabitable for years. The immediate kill zone, a radius of approximately 700 miles from the eruption site, would experience pyroclastic flows, toxic gas emissions, and complete ecological collapse. Even with advance warning, there weren't enough resources to evacuate more than a fraction of the affected population. But the most damning section came toward the end. Cross-reference construction projects that had been authorized and funded over the past decade. Underground facilities in Colorado, Utah, and South Dakota, officially described as continuity of government installations or strategic resource storage sites. The locations formed a clear pattern, far enough from Yellowstone to avoid the immediate devastation, supplied with independent power and air filtration systems, and sized to accommodate the Tier 1 population for extended periods. None of the facilities were located in Wyoming or Montana, the states that would bear the brunt of the initial eruption. The people living in those areas including Eli himself, were considered acceptable losses. A sound in the corridor outside made Eli freeze. Footsteps were approaching the archive room, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. He quickly photographed the most critical pages with his phone, replaced the file, and pretended to be reviewing mundane seismic reports. The door opened to reveal Deputy Director Webb and a woman Eli didn't recognise, both wearing the kind of serious expressions that accompanied discussions of national security. "Grant," Webb nodded, "working late again, I see." "Just catching up on some routine analysis," Eli replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The woman studied him with interest. "You're the intern who's been flagged for unusual database access patterns. I prefer to think of myself as thorough." Webb laughed, but the sound held no humour. "Thoroughness is admirable. Discretion is essential. I trust you understand the distinction." After they left, Eli sat alone in the archive room, staring at the photos on his phone. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. A small group of government officials and scientists had known for years that Yellowstone was approaching a catastrophic eruption, and their response had been to save themselves while leaving everyone else to die. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of people were going about their daily lives, making plans for the future, raising children and building careers, completely unaware that their government had already written them off as collateral damage in a disaster that could be predicted but not prevented. That night, Eli returned to his apartment in Gardner, Montana, with the decision crystallizing in his mind. The evidence he'd gathered was enough to expose the conspiracy, but he needed more. Documentation that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. He also needed a way to get the information to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. What he didn't know was that his activities in the archive had been monitored in real time, and that his phone's camera had triggered security algorithms designed to detect unauthorized photography of classified documents. By the time he fell asleep that night, plans were already being made to ensure that Eli Grant's investigation would end before it could threaten the carefully constructed wall of silence surrounding Yellowstone's deadly secret. Chapter 3. The Suppression. Gardner, Montana, November the 8th, 2016. Eli's apartment had been turned upside down with surgical precision. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and dumped, every electronic device missing or destroyed. But the most telling detail was what the intruders hadn't done. They'd left his television, his expensive hiking equipment, and the cash he kept in a kitchen drawer. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had been looking for specific items and they'd found them. His laptop was gone. His external hard drives were missing. Even his backup thumb drives, hidden in a hollowed-out book, had been discovered and taken. Months of carefully gathered evidence had vanished in a single night, leaving behind only the photos on his phone. Photos he'd been smart enough to upload to a secure cloud storage account before going to bed. Eli stood in his wrecked living room, surveying the damage with a mixture of fear and determination. They'd sent a message: stop digging, or face consequences. But they'd also confirmed that his investigation was getting close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. His phone buzzed with a text from Karen. "Meet me at Mammoth Terraces, north side. Come alone." 30 minutes later, Eli found Karen standing on the limestone terraces that gave Mammoth Hot Springs its name, her park ranger uniform stark against the white mineral deposits. Steam rose from the thermal features around them, creating an otherworldly landscape that felt appropriate for the conversation they were about to have. "They hit your place," she said without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because they're watching all of us now. Anyone who's asked too many questions, anyone who's shown too much interest in the wrong data." Karen gestured toward the thermal features. "You see these springs? They've been active for thousands of years, but their flow patterns have changed dramatically in the past 18 months. The thermal system is destabilizing. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you've stumbled into." Karen's expression was grim. "I told you I worked on the Deep Bore project. What I didn't tell you is why I really left." She led him away from the main viewing area, down a maintenance trail that wound behind the limestone formations. The drilling operation was based out of a temporary facility near the Norris Geyser Basin. Officially, we were installing seismic monitoring equipment at depth that would provide better data about magma chamber activity. But that wasn't the real purpose. The real purpose was to tap into the magma chamber and create controlled release valves. The theory was sound. If you could bleed off pressure gradually, you might prevent a catastrophic eruption, or at least delay it long enough to develop better evacuation procedures. They emerged onto a small plateau that offered a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, Eli could see the geometric lines of roads and buildings that marked human presence in the wilderness, tiny and fragile against the vast landscape. What went wrong? Everything. The magma chamber is far more complex than the models predicted. Instead of bleeding off pressure, the venting systems created new pathways for thermal activity. The timeline for eruption may have been accelerated rather than delayed. Karen pulled a small device from her pocket, an encrypted satellite phone that Eli recognized as military hardware. Tom Rodriguez was the lead contractor on the drilling team. Geothermal engineer, 23 years of experience, 3 kids. He started asking questions about why the pressure readings weren't matching the theoretical models. What happened to him? Vehicle accident on a mountain road. Lost control on a curve, went over a cliff. Very tragic. Very convenient. Karen's jaw tightened. Except Tom was one of the most careful drivers I'd ever met, and he'd driven that road hundreds of times. Also, his personal notes about the pressure anomalies disappeared from his trailer the same night he died. The implication was clear and terrifying. Eli was looking at a conspiracy that had already committed murder to protect its secrets. His ransacked apartment wasn't just a warning, it was a preview of what could happen if he continued to threaten their operational security. Why haven't you gone public with this? With what? A story about a secret government project with no documentation, a convenient accident with no witnesses, and seismic data that gets scrubbed from official records. Karen shook her head. They've been very careful to keep everything compartmentalized. Most of the people involved only know pieces of the puzzle. But together we know enough to expose them. Together we know enough to get killed. Karen handed him the satellite phone. This is encrypted and routes through military satellites. They can't monitor it easily. If something happens to me, use it to contact investigative journalists. The access codes are programmed in. As they walked back toward the main trail, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was now part of a resistance movement he'd never asked to join, fighting against a conspiracy that had resources and ruthlessness he could barely comprehend. That night, he uploaded everything he'd learned to multiple secure cloud accounts, created encrypted copies of all his evidence, and began drafting detailed summaries that could be understood by journalists without scientific backgrounds. If something happened to him, the truth would still survive. What he didn't know was that Karen Holt had already been marked for elimination, and that his own name had moved to the top of a very short list of people who knew too much to be allowed to live. The conspiracy had spent years perfecting the art of making problematic people disappear without raising suspicions. Eli Grant was about to discover just how efficient they'd become. Chapter 4. The False Flag. Lamar Valley, Yellowstone National Park, June 15th, 2017. The video went viral within hours of being uploaded. Shot on a tourist's smartphone from the Lamar Valley overlook, it showed something that no park official could easily explain away. Nearly 1,000 bison streaming eastward in a coordinated exodus that looked more like a military retreat than seasonal migration. Eli watched the footage for the 12th time, pausing on frames that showed the animals' behaviour. Their ears were pinned back, their movements urgent and purposeful. These weren't animals wandering to new grazing areas. They were fleeing something that had triggered every survival instinct evolution had given them. The official response came within 6 hours. Park spokeswoman Janet Morrison appeared on CNN to explain that large herbivore migrations were completely normal, and that social media was creating panic over natural phenomena that occur regularly in Yellowstone. What Morrison didn't mention was that the bison were fleeing from a section of the park that had been closed to public access for the past 3 months. The Norrisback Basin, officially under restoration after minor geothermal changes, was actually experiencing subsurface temperatures that had increased by nearly 40 degrees Celsius in the past year. Eli had seen the classified reports. New fumaroles were opening weekly. The ground temperature was rising so rapidly that park maintenance crews couldn't approach the monitoring equipment without protective suits. Most telling of all, the area was showing magnetic anomalies consistent with massive metallic intrusions, exactly what you'd expect if the magma chamber was rising toward the surface. His phone buzzed with a message from Karen. "Need to show you something. Tonight. Usual place." They met after midnight at the Mammoth Terraces, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. Karen looked haggard, her face showing the strain of months spent living with dangerous knowledge. "I've been monitoring radio traffic from the restricted zones," she said without preamble. "FEMA has been conducting something called Operation Continuity. Not training exercises, actual deployment." "Deployment of what?" "Command and control infrastructure. They've been installing communication arrays, power systems, and what sounds like permanent housing facilities." Karen pulled out a topographic map marked with red circles. "All of these locations correspond to abandoned Cold War bunkers or natural cave systems. They're building something underground." Eli studied the map. The marked locations formed a rough circle around the Yellowstone caldera, each one positioned outside the immediate blast zone but close enough to maintain operational oversight of the area. How many people could these facilities support? Based on the supply manifests I've been able to intercept, maybe 2,000 people per facility. Enough for essential government personnel and their families, plus a skeleton crew to maintain basic infrastructure. The scope of the deception was staggering. While telling the public that Yellowstone posed no immediate threat, the government was quietly building underground cities designed to preserve a small fraction of the population through the greatest natural disaster in human history. "I want to see one of these facilities." Karen shook her head. "Too dangerous. They've got military-grade security at all the sites now." "Then how do we prove any of this exists?" "We don't. Not directly." Karen handed him a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. "But we can document the construction activity. This is a ground-penetrating radar unit, modified to detect large underground structures. If we can map the facilities from the surface, we can prove they exist without having to penetrate their security." 2 nights later, they drove to a remote area near the Shoshone National Forest, following Forest Service roads that weren't marked on any public maps. The official designation was a wildlife research station, but the facilities visible from the access road looked more like a military installation than a scientific outpost. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire surrounded the compound. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and what appeared to be automated weapon systems monitored the perimeter. Most telling of all, massive air conditioning units and ventilation systems indicated that whatever was happening here required significant life support infrastructure. Karen set up the ground-penetrating radar while Eli photographed everything he could see from their concealed position. The radar readings revealed the truth. Beneath the modest surface facilities lay a complex that extended at least 5 levels underground, with enough space to house thousands of people for extended periods. "My God," Eli whispered as he studied the readouts. "It's like an underground city." "One of at least 6 that we know of," Karen replied. "And this is just what they're building in Wyoming and Montana. Intelligence suggests similar facilities are under construction throughout the western United States." As they packed up their equipment, Eli felt a mixture of vindication and terror. They now had proof that the government was secretly preparing for a Yellowstone eruption, while publicly denying any threat existed. But they also had evidence of a conspiracy so vast and well-funded that challenging it openly would be tantamount to suicide. The drive back to Gardner was tense and quiet. Both of them understood that they'd crossed a line tonight, moving from passive observation to active intelligence gathering. The people behind the conspiracy would not tolerate this kind of direct surveillance for long. Karen was right to be worried. Unknown to either of them, their activities had been monitored by satellite surveillance systems designed to detect exactly this kind of unauthorized reconnaissance. Facial recognition algorithms had identified them both, and their vehicle's license plate had been flagged in law enforcement databases across the region. Within hours, orders would be issued for their immediate apprehension and detention. The conspiracy had decided that Karen Holt and Eli Grant had become too dangerous to remain free. But first, they had to be isolated from any support networks or escape routes. The plan that had been set in motion would ensure that when they disappeared, no one would think to look for them until it was far too late to matter. Chapter 5. The Smoking Gun. Secure conference room, undisclosed location, August 3rd, 2017. The recording device was smaller than a matchbox, designed to look like a routine equipment monitoring sensor of the type found throughout government facilities. Eli had placed it in the ventilation system of conference room C7 3 hours earlier, using his maintenance access codes to enter the secure wing of the Denver Federal Building. What he captured on that device would become the smoking gun that proved everything he'd suspected about the Yellowstone conspiracy. The voices on the recording were clearly identifiable. Deputy Director Webb from FEMA, Assistant Secretary of Interior Patricia Vance, and at least 2 other officials whose identities Eli couldn't immediately determine. Their conversation was conducted with the casual tone of people who believed they were speaking in complete privacy. "The latest projections show we're ahead of schedule," Webb's voice came through clearly. "Thermal expansion in the Norris sector is accelerating faster than the models predicted." "How much faster?" Vance asked. 18 to 24 months ahead of the original timeline. We may be looking at a 2029 event rather than 2031. The sound of papers shuffling was audible before another voice joined the conversation. "The infrastructure projects are proceeding on schedule, but we'll need to accelerate the relocation of essential personnel if the timeline has moved up." "What about public disclosure?" Vance asked. Webb's laugh was bitter. "Public disclosure remains a non-option. We've run every scenario through the simulation models. Even with a full year of advance warning, we couldn't evacuate more than 15% of the affected population. The interstate system would collapse within hours, supply chains would break down completely, and we'd face massive social unrest that would interfere with Tier 1 evacuation procedures." "So we maintain the current posture?" "We maintain the lie," Webb corrected. "Continue the public briefings about normal seismic activity. Continue dismissing online speculation as conspiracy theories. And most importantly, continue the media relationships that keep investigative journalists focused on other stories." Eli's hands trembled as he listened to the casual discussion of abandoning hundreds of millions of people to die. These weren't comic book villains plotting world domination. They were mid-level government bureaucrats who had decided that preserving their own lives and positions was more important than honouring their oath to serve the public. The recording continued with logistical discussions that were even more damning. Supply caches were being positioned at the underground facilities. Communication networks that would remain operational during and after the eruption were being tested. Even arrangements for maintaining genetic diversity in the post-eruption population were being planned with clinical efficiency. "What about the monitoring station personnel?" an unidentified voice asked. "Some of them are asking uncomfortable questions." "We're handling that," Webb replied. "Enhanced security protocols, selective information sharing, and when necessary, personnel reassignments to less sensitive positions." "What about the ones who have already seen too much?" "Problem solved," Webb's voice carried a note of finality that made Eli's stomach turn. "The park ranger who was asking questions about the deep bore project will be transferred to a remote station in Alaska next week. A routine reassignment that gets her away from Yellowstone and limits her access to sensitive information. Karen." They were talking about Karen, and Eli knew with sickening certainty that her reassignment would be permanent in ways that had nothing to do with Park Service bureaucracy. The meeting concluded with assignments and timelines that painted a clear picture of a conspiracy in its final phases. The underground facilities would be fully operational by 2028. Essential personnel would begin training exercises that were actually disguised evacuations by early 2029, and the public would remain completely unaware until the eruption made further secrecy impossible. Eli retrieved the recording device later that night, his heart pounding as he navigated the empty corridors of the federal building. The evidence he now possessed was explosive enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, if he could find a way to get it to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or discredited. But first he had to warn Karen about her impending reassignment. He tried calling her cell phone but got no answer. Her ranger station reported that she was off duty and couldn't be reached for routine inquiries. Growing increasingly worried, Eli drove to her apartment in Mammoth Hot Springs, only to find it dark and apparently empty. Karen's supervisor, when Eli finally tracked him down, was apologetic but unhelpful. Officer Holt has been temporarily assigned to a special project in Alaska. She left this morning on a charter flight. Very sudden, but you know how it is with Park Service priorities. Eli knew exactly how it was. Karen Holt had become a liability, and liabilities were being eliminated with bureaucratic efficiency. Her disappearance was a warning and a preview of his own fate if he continued to threaten the conspiracy's operational security. That night, he uploaded the recording to multiple secure servers and began reaching out to investigative journalists whose work suggested they couldn't be easily intimidated. The evidence was now beyond their ability to suppress completely, but Eli understood that possessing it had made him the most dangerous man in America. He was no longer just a witness to the conspiracy. He was the only person outside their organisation who could prove it existed, and that made him a target that couldn't be allowed to remain free. Chapter 6. The Countdown. Gardner, Montana, November 12, 2017. The email from ProPublica journalist Michael Chen arrived at 3:47 a.m, marked with encryption protocols that indicated he'd taken Eli's warnings about government surveillance seriously. The message was brief, but electrifying. Audio verified by 3 independent sources. Document analysis confirms authenticity. Ready to publish. Needs secure meeting to discuss protection protocols. Eli had been living as a fugitive in his own life for 3 months, changing locations nightly and communicating only through encrypted channels. The strain was showing. He'd lost 20 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and started checking his rearview mirror obsessively whenever he drove. But Chen's message confirmed that the months of careful evidence gathering had finally produced results that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. What Eli didn't know was that his encrypted communications had been compromised for weeks, and that every message he'd sent to journalists was being monitored by the same people he was trying to expose. The conspiracy's response was swift and multi-pronged. Within hours of Chen's message, every major news network received exclusive briefings from USGS officials debunking dangerous misinformation about Yellowstone. The briefings included carefully edited seismic data, testimonials from concerned scientists about the psychological damage caused by eruption rumours, and veiled threats about the national security implications of spreading geological panic. Chen's editor killed the story before it could be published. The official reason was insufficient corroboration from government sources. The real reason became clear when Chen contacted Eli through secure channels. ProPublica's major donors had received calls from federal officials suggesting that publishing unverified geological speculation could affect the organisation's non-profit status. But the conspiracy had underestimated the modern information landscape. Eli's evidence had been distributed to dozens of journalists, bloggers, and citizen researchers, while mainstream media outlets could be pressured into silence. The decentralised nature of online publishing made complete suppression impossible. On November the 15th, the story broke simultaneously across 17 different platforms. Independent journalists published the recordings. Geology professors confirmed the technical details. Former government employees provided additional context about the classified facilities. Within 48 hours, #Yellowstone conspiracy was trending globally. The government's response was predictable and desperate. Official spokespeople dismissed the evidence as sophisticated disinformation designed to undermine public confidence in scientific institutions. The recordings were declared fabricated using advanced audio manipulation technology. Alternative explanations were provided for every piece of evidence Eli had gathered, but the dam had broken. Whistleblowers within the conspiracy began coming forward with additional documentation. Satellite images of the underground facilities appeared online. Construction workers who had built the secret bunkers shared their stories. Karen Holt, who had been held at a debriefing facility in Alaska, was released and immediately went public with her testimony about the Deep Bore project. The revelation that the government had been planning to abandon 300 million Americans to die while saving only a privileged few sparked the largest protests in American history. Demonstrations erupted in every major city. Congressional hearings were demanded. International allies expressed outrage at being kept in the dark about a disaster that would affect global climate and agriculture. Most importantly, real evacuation planning finally began. With the truth exposed, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that Yellowstone posed no threat. Scientists worked around the clock to develop actual emergency response procedures. International cooperation emerged as other countries offered to assist with evacuation and resettlement efforts. Chapter 7. The Final Message. Yellowstone National Park, January 20th, 2029. Eli stood on the Lamar Valley overlook, watching steam rise from thermal features that had doubled in intensity over the past 18 months. The park was nearly empty now. Evacuations had begun 6 months earlier when seismic activity had become impossible to hide. The animals had fled long ago following instincts older than human civilization. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Global Yellowstone Monitoring Consortium, an international scientific collaboration that had formed after the conspiracy's exposure. Seismic precursors accelerating. Event window now estimated at 72 to 96 hours. Final evacuation protocols activated. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same evidence that the conspiracy had tried to suppress for decades was now being used to save millions of lives. The underground facilities that had been built for a privileged few were being converted into evacuation centres for ordinary families. The communication networks designed to preserve government continuity were now coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in human history. Not everyone could be saved. The logistics were still overwhelming, but transparency had enabled genuine preparation instead of elite preservation. International agreements had been signed to relocate climate refugees. Agricultural systems had been modified to function with altered growing conditions. Supply chains had been restructured to survive massive disruption. Eli's satellite phone rang. Karen's voice came through clearly from her position at the Evacuation Coordination Center in Denver. "Final transport leaves Gardner in 30 minutes, she reported. "You need to be on it." "I'll be there," Eli replied, but he remained standing on the overlook for several more minutes. Below him, Yellowstone spread out in its terrible beauty, a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, about to be transformed by forces that made human concerns seem trivial. His phone's camera was still recording as he delivered his final message. "This is Eli Grant, reporting from Yellowstone National Park on January 20th, 2029. In approximately 3 days, this place will become ground zero for the largest volcanic eruption in human history. But unlike the conspiracy originally planned, this won't be a secret apocalypse that kills hundreds of millions while saving a few thousand elites. Because the truth came out, we've had time to prepare. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. The people fleeing this region know what's coming and why. The international community is ready to help. The aftermath will be terrible, but it won't be hidden, and it won't be used to justify abandoning the principles of democratic society. If you're watching this from the future, remember that transparency saved lives. Remember that ordinary people, when given truth instead of lies, are capable of extraordinary cooperation, and remember that the greatest disasters are always made worse by the people who try to profit from them instead of preventing them. As he walked back to his truck for the final drive to the evacuation point, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not for avoiding the catastrophe, that was beyond human power to prevent, but hope that when the crisis came, humanity would face it together rather than divided by the lies of those who valued their own survival above everyone else's. Epilogue. The quiet after the storm. New Geneva, International Reconstruction Zone, January 20th, 2034. 5 years after the Yellowstone eruption, Eli Grant stood before the International Truth and Reconciliation Commission, delivering testimony that would help ensure such a conspiracy could never again threaten global security. The hearing was being broadcast live to millions of survivors in refugee communities across 6 continents. The eruption had been as devastating as predicted. Ash fallout had disrupted global agriculture for 3 years. Climate patterns had shifted dramatically, and large areas of North America remained uninhabitable. But because the truth had emerged in time, the disaster had brought out humanity's cooperative instincts rather than its destructive ones. The Yellowstone conspiracy taught us that the greatest threats to human survival aren't natural disasters. Eli concluded his testimony. They're the institutions that respond to those disasters by protecting themselves at the expense of everyone else. Transparency isn't just an ideal, it's a survival strategy. In the audience, Karen Holt nodded her approval. She now directed the Global Early Warning Network, an international organisation dedicated to ensuring that geological threats could never again be hidden from the public. Around the world, the underground facilities originally built for elite preservation had been converted into research stations, museums and memorials dedicated to democratic accountability. The Yellowstone conspiracy had been exposed just in time to save millions of lives, but more importantly, it had revealed the difference between a society that prepares for disaster together and one that allows the powerful to abandon everyone else when crisis strikes. As Eli walked out of the hearing room into the rebuilt world beyond, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we tell ourselves we're keeping for everyone's own good. The truth, no matter how terrifying, is always preferable to a lie that serves only the few at the expense of the many. The static crackled through the shortwave radio as William Cooper's gravelly voice cut through the Arizona desert night. It was June 28th, 2001, and somewhere in the darkness of rural Eager, a man sat hunched over his microphone, delivering what would become one of the most chilling prophecies in modern conspiracy lore. "I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack," Cooper warned his listeners on the hour of the time. "But it won't be Osama bin Laden. It will be those in our own government. They're going to blame it on bin Laden. But don't you believe it?" His words hung in the electromagnetic ether, absorbed by thousands of late-night listeners across America. Radio enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, militia members, and curious insomniacs, all tuned in to hear what many considered the most dangerous voice in alternative media. Cooper's warnings about government deception, staged attacks, and the erosion of constitutional freedoms had made him a legend in underground circles. But just 4 months later, William Cooper would be dead, killed in a shootout that many believe wasn't what it seemed. His final broadcast, his prophetic warnings, and the circumstances of his death would cement his legacy as either a paranoid madman or a silenced prophet who got too close to the truth. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about conspiracy theories, government surveillance, and the price of speaking truth to power. This is the story of William Cooper, the man who warned us all and paid the ultimate price for it. Leave your video ideas in the comments below and thank Andre for this incredible outline. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories. Chapter 1. Who was William Cooper? William Milton Cooper entered this world on May 6, 1943, in a country still reeling from World War II. Born into a military family, young Bill seemed destined for a life of service and conformity. His father was a career Air Force officer, and the Cooper household moved frequently across military bases, instilling in Bill both a respect for authority and an intimate understanding of how military bureaucracy operated. After high school, Cooper followed the expected path, enlisting in the United States Navy in 1961. For the next 14 years he would serve his country with distinction, rising through the ranks and earning security clearances that would later form the foundation of his most controversial claims. By all accounts, Petty Officer Cooper was a model sailor, disciplined, intelligent, and fiercely patriotic. But something changed during his naval service. Cooper later claimed that between 1970 and 1973, while stationed in Vietnam, and later at various intelligence posts, he was assigned to briefing teams that exposed him to classified documents of the highest order. According to Cooper, these documents contained information that would shake the very foundations of reality, as most Americans understood it. The files, Cooper alleged, detailed secret treaties between the United States government and extraterrestrial beings. They outlined plans for population control, weather modification, and the systematic dismantling of the Constitution. Most shocking of all, they reveal that a shadow government, what Cooper would later call the mystery schools, had been manipulating world events for centuries, orchestrating wars, economic collapses, and social upheaval to bring about a new world order. When Cooper left the Navy in 1975, he was a changed man. The clean-cut patriot who had enlisted in 1961 emerged as something far more complex, a man carrying secrets he claimed could topple governments and expose the greatest deception in human history. For more than a decade he kept these revelations to himself, working various civilian jobs and trying to process what he had allegedly witnessed. It wasn't until the late 1980s that Cooper began speaking publicly about his experiences. At first, his lectures focused primarily on UFO cover-ups and alien government collaboration. The ufology community welcomed him with open arms. Here was an insider, a man with legitimate military credentials who could provide first-hand testimony about extraterrestrial contact. Cooper's early presentations were electrifying. He spoke with the authority of someone who had been there, seen the documents, and lived with the burden of cosmic secrets. His audiences hung on every word as he described alien bases, cattle mutilations conducted by government scientists, and secret space programs funded by black budgets. Unlike many UFO researchers who relied on second-hand accounts and fuzzy photographs, Cooper claimed direct knowledge. But Cooper's worldview was evolving. As the years passed, his focus began to shift from extraterrestrial threats to more earthbound conspiracies. He started connecting the dots between UFO secrecy and broader patterns of government deception. The aliens, he suggested, might not be the real enemy. They might be a convenient cover story for human conspirators seeking to implement global tyranny. This evolution in Cooper's thinking culminated in 1991 with the publication of Behold a Pale Horse, a sprawling nearly 500-page tome that would become one of the most influential conspiracy books ever written. The title came from the biblical book of Revelation, and I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. Behold a Pale Horse was unlike anything that had come before in conspiracy literature. Cooper didn't just focus on one theory or cover-up, he connected everything. UFOs, the Kennedy assassination, the Illuminati, FEMA camps, AIDS as a bioweapon, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which Cooper later admitted were fabricated, mind control experiments, and plans for population reduction were all woven together into a comprehensive narrative of systematic deception and control. The book's impact was immediate and profound. It flew off the shelves of independent bookstores, was passed hand to hand in militia camps, and became required reading for anyone seeking to understand the real forces shaping world events. Cooper had achieved something remarkable. He'd created a unified field theory of conspiracy that could explain virtually any disturbing event or troubling trend. More importantly, Cooper had established himself as the godfather of modern conspiracies. His work influenced a generation of researchers, broadcasters, and activists who would carry his ideas into the internet age. Names like Alex Jones, David Icke, and countless others would build upon the foundation Cooper had laid, but few would match his combination of military credibility, comprehensive worldview, and uncompromising dedication to what he saw as truth. Yet for all his influence, Cooper remained something of an outsider even within conspiracy circles. He was too radical for mainstream UFO researchers, too focused on aliens for traditional political conspiracy theorists, and too uncompromising for anyone seeking middle ground. This isolation would only intensify as Cooper transitioned from author to broadcaster, using the power of shortwave radio to spread his message to an ever-growing audience of believers and seekers. By the mid-1990s, William Cooper had become exactly what he claimed the government feared most: an informed citizen who refused to be silenced, armed with knowledge that challenged the very legitimacy of those in power. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately cost him his life, but would ensure his message lived on long after his death. The man who had started as a naval petty officer had transformed himself into something far more dangerous in the eyes of authority. A prophet of resistance, a voice of warning, and a symbol of what happens when someone gets too close to truths that powerful people want to keep hidden. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Man. By 1993, William Cooper had discovered the perfect medium for his message: shortwave radio. From his remote compound in Egar, Arizona, nestled in the White Mountains near the New Mexico border, Cooper launched the Hour of the Time, a nightly broadcast that would make him the most influential voice in American conspiracy circles, and, according to federal authorities, one of the most dangerous men in the country. The choice of shortwave was deliberate and symbolic. Unlike AM or FM radio, shortwave signals could travel vast distances, bouncing off the ionosphere to reach listeners across continents. More importantly, shortwave existed largely outside the regulatory reach of federal agencies. It was the perfect platform for a man who saw the government as an illegitimate occupying force bent on enslaving the American people. Cooper's broadcast setup was surprisingly sophisticated for a one-man operation in rural Arizona. His studio was equipped with professional-grade equipment, multiple transmitters, and backup power systems. He treated his show with the seriousness of a network television production, complete with opening music, commercial breaks filled with his own commentary, and a rigid schedule that his listeners could depend on. But it was Cooper's content that truly set him apart from other alternative broadcasters. While many shortwave hosts focused on single issues, gold prices, religious prophecy, or political commentary, Cooper offered a comprehensive worldview that connected every major event to an overarching conspiracy. Nothing happened by accident in Cooper's universe. Every terrorist attack, economic downturn, natural disaster, or political scandal was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to bring about global government under the control of ancient mystery schools and secret societies. His typical broadcast would begin with current events, which Cooper would dissect through his conspiratorial lens. A school shooting wasn't just a tragedy. It was a false flag operation designed to justify gun confiscation. A new environmental regulation wasn't an attempt to protect nature. It was part of a plan to control human movement and economic activity. A celebrity death wasn't an accident or natural occurrence. It was a ritual sacrifice by occult elites maintaining their power through blood offerings. What made Cooper particularly compelling was his presentation style. Unlike the often manic delivery of other conspiracy broadcasters, Cooper spoke with calm authority. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen behind the curtain, who possessed knowledge that lesser minds couldn't comprehend. He frequently reminded his audience of his military background, his security clearances, and his access to classified information, lending credibility to even his most outlandish claims. Cooper was also remarkably well read for a conspiracy theorist. His broadcasts were peppered with references to historical documents, philosophical treatises, and obscure academic works. He encouraged his listeners to do their own research, often spending entire shows reading primary source documents on the air. This scholarly approach distinguished him from broadcasters who relied primarily on speculation and rumour. But perhaps most significantly, Cooper positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of conspiratorial truth. He didn't just expose the New World Order, he exposed the other conspiracy researchers who he claimed were working for the enemy. Alex Jones, David Icke, and virtually every other prominent figure in the movement found themselves targeted by Cooper's devastating critiques. 99% of the people in the so-called Patriot movement are either controlled opposition or useful idiots, Cooper would declare. They put out just enough truth to gain your trust, then lead you down the wrong path when it matters most. Cooper's attacks on fellow conspiracy theorists were particularly brutal. He accused Alex Jones of being a CIA asset, whose job was to make conspiracy theorists look crazy. He dismissed UFO researchers as government disinformation agents, spreading false stories to cover up more mundane but equally sinister activities. He even turned against his former colleagues in the militia movement, claiming they had been infiltrated and compromised by federal agents. This paranoid perfectionism made Cooper enemies throughout the alternative media world, but it also enhanced his reputation among true believers. If Cooper was willing to attack his own allies for being insufficiently pure, surely his commitment to truth was absolute. His isolation became a badge of honour, proof that he alone remained uncorrupted by the forces seeking to mislead the American people. Cooper's radio show wasn't just entertainment or information, it was a form of resistance. He regularly encouraged his listeners to withdraw from the federal system entirely. He advocated for refusing to pay income taxes, removing children from public schools, avoiding social security numbers, and preparing for armed resistance against government tyranny. The IRS has no legal authority to collect taxes from American citizens, Cooper would thunder. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation stealing from the American people. The entire federal government is operating outside the Constitution and has no legitimacy whatsoever. These weren't just abstract political positions for Cooper, they were personal commitments. In the mid-1990s, he stopped filing tax returns and began declaring his Arizona property sovereign territory outside the jurisdiction of federal and state authorities. He stockpiled weapons, food and supplies, preparing for what he saw as an inevitable confrontation with government agents. Cooper's compound became a fortress. Security cameras monitored all approaches. Motion sensors and alarms covered the perimeter. Multiple weapons caches were strategically positioned throughout the property. Cooper rarely left his mountain retreat, and when he did, he travelled heavily armed and hyper-vigilant for surveillance or attack. This militant preparation wasn't driven by general paranoia. Cooper had specific reasons to believe he was being targeted. His FBI file, later released through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed extensive surveillance dating back to the early 1990s. Federal agents monitored his broadcasts, infiltrated his lectures, and tracked his financial activities. They classified him as a militia extremist and potential domestic terrorist, despite the fact that Cooper never advocated initiating violence against anyone. The government's concern was understandable from their perspective. Cooper's influence was growing exponentially. His books were bestsellers in alternative circles. His radio show attracted hundreds of thousands of regular listeners. His lectures drew packed audiences across the country. Most dangerously, his message was inspiring others to take action. Militia groups cited Cooper's work as justification for their activities. Tax resistors used his arguments in court cases. Survivalists and separatists quoted his warnings about coming persecution. Cooper seemed to relish his status as public enemy number one. He frequently read portions of his FBI file on the air, mocking federal agents as jackbooted thugs and traitors to the Constitution. He He would often interrupt his regular programming to report suspicious activities around his property, unmarked helicopters, strange vehicles, or unusual electronic interference that he attributed to government monitoring. "They want to kill me," Cooper would tell his audience matter-of-factly. "They're going to make it look like I started trouble, like I shot first, like I was a dangerous criminal who had to be stopped. But I'm telling you right now, if I die, it won't be because I initiated violence. It will be because I told the truth they can't allow to be heard." These warnings became more frequent and specific as the 1990s progressed. Cooper seemed to sense that his time was running out, that the forces he had spent years exposing were finally moving to silence him permanently. He began making detailed predictions about how his death would be staged, what justifications would be used, and how the media would portray him after he was gone. To his followers, these prophecies would prove to be his most accurate predictions of all. To skeptics, they seemed like the paranoid fantasies of a man whose grip on reality was slipping. But everyone agreed on one thing. William Cooper had made himself the most dangerous enemy of the federal government, and that rarely ended well for the individual involved. The stage was set for a final confrontation, but first, Cooper would deliver one more prophecy that would cement his reputation as either a madman or a prophet. On that fateful night in June 2001, he would make a prediction so specific and accurate that it would seem to prove everything he had been saying for years about false flag operations and government deception. Chapter 3. The Prophecy Before 9/11. The summer of 2001 was a strange time in America. The country was enjoying unprecedented prosperity, the internet was transforming daily life, and most citizens felt secure in their bubble of comfort and normalcy. But in the remote mountains of Arizona, William Cooper was sensing something ominous on the horizon. Cooper's shortwave radio broadcasts had taken on an increasingly urgent tone throughout the spring and early summer of 2001. He spoke repeatedly about impending catalyzing events that would be used to justify the implementation of martial law and the final destruction of constitutional government in America. His sources, which he claimed included active military personnel, intelligence operatives, and well-placed government insiders, were all reporting the same thing. Something big was coming, and it would change everything. It was during his June 28, 2001 broadcast that Cooper made the prediction that would define his legacy. Speaking with his characteristic calm authority, he delivered what would become one of the most chilling prophecies in the history of conspiracy theory. "Whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it," Cooper warned his listeners. "They will soon do something outrageous to gain the support of the American people, allowing them to do whatever they want to do. Watch for a major attack on American soil. They will use this to unite the American people behind their New World Order agenda." Cooper's warning wasn't a vague prediction about future troubles. It was specific, detailed, and time-sensitive. He told his audience that the attack would happen soon, that it would be blamed on bin Laden, and that it would be used to justify unprecedented expansions of government power. He urged his listeners to remember his words when the event occurred, because the media would immediately begin promoting the official narrative without asking the crucial questions about who really benefited from the attack. "Osama bin Laden is a CIA asset," Cooper explained. "He's been working with American intelligence for decades. When they're ready to use him as a patsy, they'll activate him for one final operation. But don't think for a moment that he's actually the mastermind. The real architects of this operation sit in Washington, not in some cave in Afghanistan." Cooper's analysis was based on his understanding of what intelligence professionals call false flag operations, attacks carried out by one group but designed to appear as if they were perpetrated by someone else. He had studied the history of such operations extensively, from the Reichstag fire that brought the Nazis to power, to the Gulf of Tonkin incident that escalated American involvement in Vietnam, to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing that Cooper claimed was orchestrated by federal agents. According to Cooper's worldview, false flag operations were the preferred method of the shadow government for advancing their agenda. Rather than trying to convince the American people to voluntarily surrender their freedoms, it was much more effective to stage dramatic attacks that would make citizens beg for protection, even at the cost of their constitutional rights. Cooper's June 28th broadcast wasn't the only time he warned about the impending attack. Throughout July and August 2001, he continued to sound the alarm, providing additional details and context. He predicted that the attack would target high-profile buildings in major American cities, that it would involve hijacked aircraft, and that the death toll would be massive enough to traumatize the entire nation. "They need body count," Cooper explained grimly. "The more Americans who die, the more outrage they can generate. They need the American people to be so angry and afraid that they'll support any military action, any new law, any expansion of government power that's presented as necessary for their safety." Cooper also predicted the specific ways the attack would be used to advance the New World Order agenda. He warned that it would lead to massive new surveillance programs that would monitor every American citizen. He predicted that it would justify invasions of multiple countries in the Middle East, regardless of their actual connection to the attack. He foresaw the creation of new government agencies with unprecedented powers to detain and interrogate American citizens without due process. Most chillingly, Cooper predicted that the attack would mark the beginning of an endless war on terror that would never actually end because it couldn't end. Its real purpose wasn't to defeat terrorism, but to create a permanent state of emergency that would allow the shadow government to complete their transformation of America from a constitutional republic into a totalitarian surveillance state. These predictions were so specific and so far-reaching that many of Cooper's regular listeners found them hard to believe. Even in conspiracy circles, there were limits to what seemed credible, and Cooper appeared to be pushing beyond those limits. Some wondered if the isolation and stress of his lifestyle were finally taking their toll on his mental state. But Cooper's warnings weren't based on paranoid fantasy. They were grounded in his systematic study of historical patterns and his understanding of how power actually operates behind the scenes. He had spent years documenting the techniques used by governments to manipulate public opinion and justify expansions of their authority. The coming attack would simply be the largest and most successful implementation of these time-tested methods. When Cooper signed off on the evening of June 28, 2001, his regular listeners settled back into their daily routines, filing his predictions away in their minds, alongside his other warnings about coming persecution and government tyranny. Most assumed they would have months or even years to prepare for whatever Cooper was predicting. None of them imagined that in just over 2 months they would be watching the Twin Towers collapse on live television, while remembering every word of Cooper's prophetic warning. September 11th, 2001 dawned clear and beautiful across the eastern United States. In Arizona, William Cooper was preparing for his regular morning routine when the first reports began coming in about a plane hitting the World Trade Center. Like millions of Americans, he initially assumed it was a tragic accident, until the second plane hit, and then the Pentagon, and then United 93 crashed in Pennsylvania. As Cooper watched the attacks unfold on television, his reaction was unlike that of most Americans. While the country was experiencing shock, grief and confusion, Cooper felt a grim satisfaction that his predictions had proven accurate. Everything was happening exactly as he had warned. The massive death toll, the spectacular visuals designed for maximum psychological impact, the immediate focus on Osama bin Laden as the mastermind, and the calls for unity behind whatever response the government deemed necessary. Within hours of the attacks, Cooper was back on the air, reminding his listeners of his June 28th warning and providing real-time analysis of how the events were being used to implement the pre-planned agenda he had exposed months earlier. His audience, stunned by the accuracy of his predictions, began spreading the word throughout alternative media circles. William Cooper, the man who had been dismissed as a paranoid conspiracy theorist, had just made the most accurate prediction in the history of alternative media. In the days and weeks following 9/11, as the government rolled out exactly the surveillance programs, military interventions and expansions of executive power that Cooper had predicted, his credibility reached unprecedented heights. But Cooper's moment of vindication would also seal his fate. If he had been dangerous to the establishment before 9/11, he was now absolutely lethal. His accurate prediction proved that he had access to genuine inside information about government operations. His growing influence proved that his message was resonating with an ever-expanding audience. His uncompromising hostility proved that he would never be co-opted or silenced voluntarily. For William Cooper, being right about 9/11 wasn't a victory, it was a death sentence. The same forces he had spent years exposing now had to eliminate him before he could cause even more damage to their carefully constructed narrative. The countdown to his final confrontation had begun. Chapter 4, November the 5th, 2001. The autumn air was crisp in the White Mountains of Arizona as November settled over William Cooper's fortified compound. It had been nearly 2 months since the September 11th attacks, and Cooper's influence had never been greater. His accurate prediction had transformed him from a marginalised conspiracy theorist into a prophetic voice that commanded respect even among skeptics. His shortwave broadcasts were reaching record audiences, his website traffic had exploded, and his books were flying off the shelves as Americans searched for explanations that made sense of their transformed world. But Cooper's vindication had come at a price. His FBI file, already thick with surveillance reports and threat assessments, was growing daily. Federal agents were monitoring his every broadcast, analysing his every statement and tracking his every movement. The man who had accurately predicted the most devastating attack in American history was now seen as a clear and present danger to national security. Cooper seemed to sense that his time was running out. His broadcasts throughout October had taken on an increasingly urgent tone, as if he were racing against time to deliver his complete message before being silenced. He spent entire shows reading his will on the air, making detailed arrangements for the continuation of his work after his death, and providing specific instructions to his followers about how to respond if he were killed. "I will not commit suicide," Cooper declared repeatedly during his final broadcasts. "I will not die in a car accident. I will not die of a heart attack or drug overdose. If any of these things happen to me, you will know that I was murdered by agents of the federal government. They will try to make it look accidental or justifiable, but you must not believe their lies." Cooper's paranoia was well-founded. Federal authorities had indeed been developing plans to neutralise what they saw as an increasingly dangerous domestic terrorist. His accurate prediction about 9/11 had elevated him from a routine surveillance target to an active threat requiring immediate action. The question wasn't whether to move against Cooper, but when and how to do it in a way that wouldn't create a martyr or validate his conspiracy theories. The opportunity came through what appeared to be a completely unrelated incident. Earlier in 2001, Cooper had been involved in a confrontation with several teenagers who had allegedly trespassed on his property. According to the official report, Cooper had brandished a weapon and threatened the youths, leading to charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. A warrant for his arrest had been issued, but Navajo County Sheriff's deputies had been reluctant to serve it, knowing Cooper's reputation and the likelihood of violent resistance. The warrant sat on a desk for months while authorities debated the best approach. Some advocated for a daylight raid with overwhelming force. Others suggested attempting to arrest Cooper away from his compound when he made one of his rare trips to town. A few even proposed negotiating his surrender through intermediaries who might be able to reason with him. But by early November 2001, the decision had been made at levels far above the local sheriff's office. William Cooper had become too dangerous to remain free, and the aggravated assault warrant provided the perfect legal justification for taking him down. Unlike the federal charges that might have been brought for his tax resistance or anti-government activities, a simple state criminal warrant appeared routine and non-political. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Deputies would conduct a nighttime raid on Cooper's compound, ostensibly to serve the assault warrant. Cooper would resist, as everyone knew he would, and in the ensuing gunfight, he would be killed in what appeared to be a justified use of deadly force. No conspiracy theories, no martyrdom, no questions about government overreach. just a dangerous criminal who chose to shoot it out with law enforcement rather than face justice in court. The operation was scheduled for the evening of November 5th, 2001, Guy Fawkes Day, though this symbolic date was likely coincidental. Sheriff's deputies conducted surveillance of the compound throughout the day, noting Cooper's movements and the defensive preparations he had made over the years. The approach routes were mapped, contingency plans were developed, and rules of engagement were established. What happened next depends entirely on whose account you believe. According to the official version released by the Navajo County Sheriff's Office, deputies approached Cooper's residence at approximately 11:40 p.m. to serve the outstanding warrant. Cooper was outside his home when the deputies arrived and immediately opened fire on the officers without warning. Deputy Robert Marinez was struck in the head by Cooper's initial shots, but managed to return fire along with other deputies. Cooper was hit multiple times and died at the scene. The entire firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. The official narrative was clean, simple, and legally bulletproof. A dangerous criminal had resisted arrest and paid the ultimate price for his poor judgment. Deputy Marinez survived his wounds, and no other officers were injured. The warrant was legitimate, the operation was conducted by the book, and the use of deadly force was entirely justified under Arizona law. But Cooper's supporters immediately noted the inconsistencies in the official story. Why was a high-risk arrest attempted at night when it could have been done safely during daylight hours? Why weren't less lethal alternatives attempted before resorting to deadly force? Why was Cooper, who was known to be intelligent and tactical, standing outside his home in the open where he would be vulnerable? Why did he allegedly fire first when he had spent years warning his listeners that he would be set up in exactly this scenario? The inconsistencies multiplied as more details emerged. Witnesses reported hearing automatic weapons fire, though deputies claimed to have used only standard service weapons. The crime scene was processed by federal agents rather than local investigators, despite this being a county-level arrest warrant. Cooper's computer equipment and broadcasting gear were seized as evidence, though they had no relevance to an aggravated assault case from months earlier. Most suspicious of all was the timing. Cooper had spent years predicting that the government would move against him immediately after a major false flag operation, when his credibility was at its peak and his influence was growing. His death coming just 8 weeks after the 9/11 attacks he had specifically predicted would be blamed on bin Laden, seemed to validate his most paranoid warnings. Cooper's final broadcast had aired just hours before the raid. In it, he had seemed unusually reflective, almost melancholy, as if he sensed what was coming. He spoke about his love for America, his commitment to the Constitution, and his hope that his work would inspire others to continue the fight for freedom after he was gone. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, Cooper had said, quoting Nietzsche. If you try it, you'll often be lonely, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Those would be William Cooper's last public words. By dawn on November the 6th, 2001, the voice that had warned America about the coming police state had been permanently silenced. The man who had predicted his own death had been proven right one final time. The mainstream media coverage of Cooper's death was minimal and dismissive. Most news outlets portrayed him as a deranged conspiracy theorist who had finally gotten himself killed through his own extremism. There was little investigation into the circumstances of the shooting, no questions about why the arrest had been conducted at night, and no mention of Cooper's accurate prediction about September 11th. But in alternative media circles, Cooper's death was seen as confirmation of everything he had taught. The government had eliminated him exactly as he had predicted, using exactly the methods he had described. His martyrdom transformed him from a controversial broadcaster into a legend of resistance against tyranny. The man who had spent years warning about government assassination programs had become their latest victim. The voice that had tried to wake up America to the dangers of the emerging police state had been silenced at precisely the moment when his warnings were proving most accurate. William Cooper was dead, but his message was about to reach a much larger audience than it had ever reached while he was alive. Chapter 5: Aftermath and Legacy. The news of William Cooper's death spread rapidly through the interconnected networks of shortwave radio listeners, internet forums, and alternative media outlets that had formed his primary audience. Within hours of the shooting, Cooper's supporters were sharing their own recordings of his broadcasts, analysing the official story for inconsistencies, and developing theories about who had really ordered his elimination. The immediate aftermath was telling in its stark contrasts. Mainstream media outlets that covered Cooper's death at all portrayed him as a dangerous extremist whose violent end was both predictable and justified. Law enforcement officials praised the professionalism of the deputies involved and emphasised that Cooper's death could have been avoided if he had simply surrendered peacefully. But in the alternative media ecosystem that Cooper had helped create, his death was interpreted as the ultimate validation of his teachings. Here was a man who had accurately predicted the 9/11 attacks, warned that the government would use them to implement a police state, and promised that truth-tellers would be systematically eliminated. His death, just weeks after his most dramatic vindication, seemed to prove that he had been right about everything. Cooper's widow Annie faced an immediate crisis. The family's primary source of income had been eliminated overnight, and federal authorities had seized much of Cooper's equipment and broadcasting infrastructure as evidence in the shooting investigation. More importantly, she had to decide whether to continue her husband's work or let his message die with him. Annie Cooper chose to honour her husband's memory by keeping his legacy alive. She worked with Cooper's longtime supporters to preserve his broadcasts, maintain his website, and continue distribution of his books and materials. The Hour of the Time archive became a digital shrine where new generations of conspiracy theorists could discover Cooper's complete body of work. The preservation of Cooper's legacy was aided by perfect timing. The internet was just reaching the point where massive amounts of audio and video content could be easily shared and stored. Cooper's broadcasts, which had previously been available only to shortwave radio enthusiasts willing to stay up late and tune in specific frequencies, suddenly became accessible to anyone with a computer and an internet connection. YouTube, file-sharing networks, and conspiracy websites became repositories for hundreds of hours of Cooper's lectures and radio shows. His books, previously available only through alternative bookstores and mail-order catalogues, became widely available through online retailers. Most importantly, his ideas began reaching audiences that would never have discovered him through traditional alternative media channels. Behold a Pale Horse experienced a remarkable renaissance in the years following Cooper's death. The book's sales, which had been steady but limited during Cooper's lifetime, exploded as new readers discovered his work and recommended it to others. By the mid-2000s, it was selling tens of thousands of copies annually and had been translated into multiple languages. The book's continued popularity was driven by several factors. First, many of Cooper's predictions appeared to be coming true with remarkable accuracy. The surveillance programs he had warned about were being implemented under the Patriot Act. The Middle Eastern wars he had predicted were expanding beyond Afghanistan into Iraq and beyond. The police state apparatus he had described was becoming visible in airports, government buildings, and public spaces across America. Second, Cooper's comprehensive worldview provided a framework for understanding an increasingly confusing world. As the internet exposed people to vast amounts of information and disinformation, Cooper's systematic approach to conspiracy analysis became a valuable tool for making sense of conflicting narratives and hidden connections. Third, Cooper's status as a martyr gave his ideas additional credibility. The fact that he had been killed so soon after his most accurate prediction suggested that he had indeed possessed dangerous knowledge that the establishment couldn't allow to be widely disseminated. Cooper's influence on subsequent conspiracy theorists and alternative media figures cannot be overstated. Virtually every major name in the post-9/11 truth movement drew heavily from Cooper's work, even when they disagreed with specific aspects of his theories or methodology. Alex Jones, despite Cooper's harsh criticism during their public feud, clearly built his media empire on foundations that Cooper had laid. The comprehensive worldview, the focus on false flag operations, the warnings about New World Order tyranny, and the use of alternative media platforms to bypass mainstream gatekeepers all followed the template Cooper had established. Similarly, the 9/11 truth movement that emerged in the years following the attacks relied heavily on analytical frameworks that Cooper had developed. His warnings about false flag operations provided the conceptual foundation for questioning the official narrative of the attacks. His predictions about the erosion of civil liberties provided a lens for interpreting the Bush administration's response to 9/11. The militia movement, which had been somewhat dormant during the late 1990s, experienced a revival that drew inspiration from Cooper's teachings about constitutional resistance to government tyranny. His arguments about the illegitimacy of federal authority became standard talking points for groups ranging from tax protesters to separatist communities. Even more mainstream political movements began incorporating ideas that Cooper had pioneered. The Tea Party movement's focus on constitutional originalism and resistance to federal overreach echoed themes that Cooper had been promoting for decades. The growing skepticism toward government surveillance programs vindicated Cooper's warnings about the emerging police state. Cooper's legacy was further cemented by the continued accuracy of his predictions. As the years passed and the war on terror expanded into a permanent state of global conflict, as surveillance programs grew ever more intrusive, and as civil liberties were systematically eroded in the name of security, Cooper's warnings seemed increasingly prescient. The financial crisis of 2008 provided another vindication of Cooper's economic warnings. His predictions about manufactured economic collapses designed to transfer wealth and power to elite institutions seemed to play out exactly as he had described. The bailouts of major banks, while ordinary Americans lost their homes and jobs, fit perfectly into Cooper's narrative about the real purpose of government policy. By 2010, nearly a decade after his death, William Cooper had achieved something remarkable for a conspiracy theorist: mainstream acknowledgement of his influence. Major news outlets began mentioning him in articles about the origins of contemporary conspiracy culture. Academic researchers started studying his work as a foundational text of modern alternative political thought. Even his harshest critics acknowledged that he had accurately predicted several major developments that conventional analysts had missed entirely. The rise of social media in the 2000s created new opportunities for Cooper's ideas to spread. His audio lectures became popular on platforms like iTunes and Spotify. His quotes and predictions circulated widely on Facebook and Twitter. Young people who had never heard of shortwave radio discovered his work through YouTube recommendations and podcast platforms. This digital resurrection introduced Cooper's work to a generation that had grown up after 9/11, for whom government surveillance and endless warfare were simply facts of life, rather than shocking departures from American tradition. For these younger audiences, Cooper wasn't a paranoid conspiracy theorist, but a prophet who had accurately described the world they inhabited. Cooper's influence extended beyond politics into popular culture. Hip-hop artists quoted his work in their lyrics. Television shows referenced his theories. Novelists incorporated his ideas into their plots. The man who had died in obscurity on a remote mountain in Arizona had somehow become a cultural icon whose ideas permeated mainstream consciousness. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of Cooper's legacy was how his work had prepared people to question official narratives during subsequent crises. When new terrorist attacks occurred, when mass shootings dominated headlines, when economic crises erupted, or when pandemic emergencies were declared, millions of Americans instinctively applied the analytical framework Cooper had taught them. They asked who benefited from these events. They looked for evidence of government foreknowledge. They examined how crises were being used to justify expansions of state power. They questioned whether the official explanations made logical sense or served hidden agendas. In short, they thought like William Cooper had taught them to think. Epilogue: The Man Who Wouldn't Be Quiet. Today, more than 2 decades after his death, William Cooper's voice continues to echo through the digital landscape of alternative media. His final warning, delivered just hours before his death, has been viewed millions of times on video platforms. "I will not commit suicide. If I am killed, it will be because I told the truth that they couldn't allow to be heard." The compound in Egar, Arizona, where Cooper made his last stand, has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for truth seekers and conspiracy researchers. Visitors come to pay their respects to the man who sacrificed everything to warn his fellow Americans about the forces working to destroy their freedom. The broadcasting equipment is long gone, but the spirit of resistance that Cooper embodied lives on. Cooper's books continue to sell thousands of copies each year, introduced to new readers by word-of-mouth recommendations and internet searches for forbidden knowledge. Behold a Pale Horse remains one of the most influential conspiracy texts ever written, its pages dog-eared and annotated by readers who see their world reflected in Cooper's warnings from 3 decades ago. The questions Cooper raised about government deception, media manipulation, and the erosion of constitutional rights have only become more relevant with time. As surveillance technology advances, as military conflicts expand, and as emergency powers become normalised, his warnings about the emerging police state seem less like paranoid fantasy and more like inevitable reality. Perhaps most remarkably, Cooper's reputation has been rehabilitated even among some who once dismissed him as a dangerous extremist. His accurate prediction about 9/11, combined with the subsequent vindication of many of his other warnings, has forced even skeptics to acknowledge that he possessed genuine insights into how power operates behind the scenes of official politics. The man who started as a small-town broadcaster with a shortwave radio has become something he never sought to be, a prophet whose warnings transcended his own time and place. His message has outlived his enemies, outlasted their attempts to silence him, and continues to inspire new generations of Americans to question authority and seek truth behind official narratives. In the end, the forces that killed William Cooper failed to achieve their ultimate objective. They silenced his voice, but they couldn't silence his message. They destroyed his broadcasting equipment, but they couldn't destroy the ideas he had already planted in the minds of his listeners. They eliminated the messenger, but the message lived on, spreading through digital networks they couldn't control and reaching audiences they never anticipated. The final irony of William Cooper's story is that his death proved his theories more effectively than his life ever could. By killing him exactly as he predicted they would, his enemies provided the ultimate validation of his warnings about government assassination programs and the silencing of truth-tellers. Today, as Americans grapple with revelations about mass surveillance, false flag operations and government deception that Cooper warned about decades ago, his final question echoes with renewed urgency. Was William Cooper a paranoid broadcaster who got himself killed, or a prophet silenced for revealing the biggest secret of all? The answer to that question may determine whether Americans can reclaim the republic that Cooper died trying to defend, or whether his warnings will stand as the epitaph for a freedom that was lost while people still believed they were free. His voice may have been silenced, but William Cooper's warning continues to resonate. Wake up, or lose everything you think you hold dear. The choice, as always, remains ours to make.